Are going to continue with topic 2 from before lunch for the next hour. This will be subtopic C, dealing with popular culture, movies, books, and music. We have two superb presenters here. We will lead off with Professor Zhou Qing'an, who is Assistant Professor and Director of the Public Diplomacy Research Program at Tsinghua University School of Journalism and Communications. And he will be followed by Robert Daly, who is the Director of the Maryland-China Initiative at the University of Maryland, and who previously served for 6 years as the American Director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies in Nanjing, China. Professor Zhou? Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador Roya, and thank you for all your patience to stay here for the second half of our discussion. I will talk about the U.S. image in Chinese popular culture. It's really a huge topic, so I named my presentation as Who Are They and Who Are We? So when we ask who are they, actually we ask who are Americans in Chinese popular culture. But as you know, Who Are We is a very famous, is a name of a very famous book which was written by Professor Samuel Huntington to talk about American identify in past times. Many people think it's a typical American problem because when they talk about that, actually talking about the joint characteristic of a nation. But actually, after the reforming and opening of China, we are still talking about who we are in the modern society and in the modernization process in Chinese modern history. So I connect two topics together to try to clarify the U.S. image in China's popular culture. So, but I still find it's ambitious to try to talk about American image in the popular culture in China because it's very hard to examine the image in pop culture. You know, in Chinese pop culture, we have three kind of foreigners which are very often to be mentioned in the books, in the movies, or in the music. The first is Japs, 日本鬼子, which is very which is very clear, very negative and very clear. The second is the Red Army of the Soviet Union, who is also very clear because they helped China for quite a long time in the anti-Japanese war. But when we talk about the third, American, actually, it's very complexity problem that we cannot find a very clear objective to describe that. This is the first problem for me to understand this topic. The second problem for me is try to describe Chinese popular culture. What's Chinese popular culture? The host give me some idol to say that books, movies, and music. But actually, there are many characteristics of Chinese popular culture. Like we are talking about fiction and non-fiction, movies, TV series, including internet and many others. And the source of China's popular culture are diversified as well. Like Chinese popular culture is not only influenced by the domestic culture, by the Chinese culture, but also influenced by outside culture. Furthermore, since the reforming and opening up, outside culture has even more influence to Chinese public culture. And there are two different discourses in Chinese popular culture. One is we call elite or official, but the other comes from the grassroots. But I find some pictures, some interesting pictures that can describe the relationship between these two issues. Let me just show you this issue. This is a picture of a bag which appeared after President Obama was elected in the late of 2009, 要为人民立新功. which is a very famous slogan in Mao Zedong's period to say, I should do new contribution to for the people. Though if you think this is Chinese people to show their attitude for President Obama, I will give you a much more private picture. This is a much more private picture. The 毛主席夸我长得帅 which means Chairman Mao praised that I'm handsome. It's much more private. You can say this is fake. Chinese people think of that. So Chinese people have another picture to show the evidence that this is not only the products of Chinese, but also the products of Americans. So they do a paper, do a picture to show that this is experience in Time magazine. There is a footnote. All the pictures come from a very famous market. Maybe you know, 秀水 market. It's a fake market. And the market always temporarily closed when US-China have the debate about the copyright. So from these three pictures, actually I found two keywords very important in Chinese pop culture. These two keywords, identify and deconstruction. When we talk about identify, actually, we talk about the function of Chinese popular culture after the reforming and the opening. And we find that actually when we talk about American image, when we talk about Americans in Chinese movie, in Chinese books, or in Chinese music, actually we are identifying ourselves. The second is deconstruction. You will find that many important words, many important conceptions in recent Chinese pop culture was deconstructed. Even very important political conception, like everyone know the conception harmony society. Harmony is a very important word in this time, but if you go to Chinese internet, you will find that this objective was used to verb, like some book will be harmonized. Do you know the meaning of harmonized? Harmonized means blocked, means forbid. So from the changing of these two words, from harmony to harmonized to harmonizing, you will find that the deconstruction of Chinese internet or deconstruction of Chinese grassroots appeared very clearly. So if we go back to the history of Americans' image in Chinese pop culture, I would like to divide it into four periods. In the first is in the last 20 hours after the Korean War, the U.S. people and the U.S. government has been described negatively in China, mainly constructed as invader. They intervened China's internal affairs. They took a favorable stand to the KMT government in China's civil war. However, during this period, we should focus on the historic background that at that time China produced very few popular culture works, and if any, they were made in isolated political content. The second time is we should try to focus is from, actually it's not from the establishment of the diplomatic Sino-US relations, it's from President Nixon's visit to China to the beginning of reforming and opening. Actually, during this time, the American image is blank, is nothing in Chinese pop music, pop culture, because you will find that at that time there is very few products of Chinese popular culture either. The third time is from the beginning of reforming and opening up to the early 1990s. During this time, Chinese people became curious about the outside world, and Chinese popular culture enjoying the blooming and the flourish period. During this period, the U.S. image changed very quickly, or we should say that U.S. image was greatly improved. The first favorable American image in Chinese mainland movie is movie called American Pilot in 1980s. From the title, you will understand that actually it talk about the American pilots' work in the World War II in China. So the film tell the story. The copy of the story was followed many times in Chinese popular culture after the 1980. So the fourth time is after the Cold War. Why I choose the timing point, because during that time we found that there is a little change. At that time, the U.S. image in China's culture becomes increasingly complicated, like the pros and the cons of coins. The mass culture displayed a strong, advanced American with high tech. On the other side, it's described arrogant country which swing in international relations and has many social problems. So these are the four periods. These five faction is the U.S. image in popular Chinese culture. They displayed in these following aspects. The first, I should mention the Hollywood movies. So talk about the Hollywood movies. Actually, they construct a direct U.S. image upon upon Chinese people. In recent years, like Chinese film group corporation introduced about 20 Hollywood movies every year, and it doesn't conclude many American movies that Chinese people get to know by internet. So the outcome of the movies is to construct a complete picture of American society, making more Chinese people to know the American political system, economic development, and the society. American movies surged into China after the reforming and opening up. And the American movie constitute overwhelming ratio of overseas movie in terms of number. Hollywood movies, along with various TV series I will mention later, provide us with a lot of materials to get to know American and influence our perception of the U.S. image in a scientific or unscientific way. So like we see many movies like Godfather, like Independence Day, like the recent Avenger and 2012. So all the movies influenced China. This is the first aspect. The second aspect is TV series. So many Chinese people, maybe they remember the very famous TV program called Growing Pain in 1980s. This is the first TV program which was imported to China in 1980s. So now, if you talk about the Chinese people, especially talk about the young ages of Chinese people, you will discuss such as 24 Hours, such as Friends. So the introduction of American TV series started from television sitcom Growing Pain, which has changed the Chinese young generation's perception in America. Nowadays, the young generations watch American TV players not only in TV but also via internet, which could be broadcasted with the American cable network. And there is some group called the Volunteers of Transcript in the internet. They serve to translate all the content of American TV series. And I heard the news that they changed their work because they found more and more Chinese young generations understand English. So they found that they lost their job. So they found a new job to translate the online lessons of American universities. So this is a new job for them. It's very exciting for all the Chinese students, but not very exciting for American universities, I think. So the third is animation industry, which means cartoons. So we talk about since the middle 1980s, China introduced Mickey and Donald, then Tom and Jerry. Now it turns to Disneyland. All these cartoons can accompany with the Chinese kids. So we can say the kids who watched the cartoons are now in their 30s, like me. So they got their first impression of the United States through these cartoons. It's very important for them to understand the outside world. The fourth, when we talk about American image in China, we talk about Chinese movies and TV players. This is a very important field. This is the direct way to form U.S. image in China. In China's popular culture, like descriptions of Americans, rarely totally about America. Most of the movies tell stories that happened between U.S. and China, or stories of Chinese people who lived in the United States. These movies reflect the American image in three dimensions. First, many movies and TV series tell stories of Chinese people's experience in America. One example, a very famous example, is Beijingers in New York. The second is work reflecting the complicated culture clash between the two countries. One good example of the kind is we call treatment, or guasha, or we call skin scraping. It's a typical Chinese medicine work. The third works focus on cooperation between China and the United States, mainly featured stories after in the World War II, such as the grief over the Yellow River, 黄河决裂. I will show the pictures later, which provide the Chinese audience with lively materials to learn about American society and Americans' contribution in the World War II. The fifth, I should say, is China's literatures, especially non-fictions. Because recent years we found more and more books to introduce American society, American cultures in Chinese bookstores. Early in 1989, the author, I should say, his name is Lian Xingqian, who published a book, Lovable Americans. This is we can find the first book to describe American society very clear and very deeply. Then, after the establishment of the diplomatic relationship between two countries, exchanging program increasingly sharply. Scholars, writers, journalists, and overseas students wrote a lot of works about American, like the famous writer like Xiao Qian and Feng Jicai, who write books to talk about American society. And some popular writers, I don't know whether you know, named Lin Da, who write a series of books to say, watch American from watch American from a close distance. There are 4 or 5 books. It's a series of books to talk about American. So these works are very important to introduce the American society and introduce the person. And we found that there are 2 important fashions during these 5 aspects. The first is Internet. Internet played a very important role to communicate different kinds of culture, like to introduce all these products. And then the second is entertainment. And you will find that more and more people who understand American from, because they try to find entertainment, they try to watch movies, they try to read simple books. So these 2 reasons make all the 5 aspects growing up in China's and Chinese cultural understanding of American. So I will talk about 4 kinds of appearance of Americans' image in China's local popular culture. For quite a long time, the culture experienced the negative image I mentioned before. But the negative image related with growing national pride, I should not use the nationalism here. I should use the national pride. Because if you talk about Huang Fei Hong, I don't know whether you know a kung fu movie in produced in Hong Kong. The enemies, including nearly all the advanced countries like Japan, Japanese, British, American. So the national pride of Chinese people was exalted to pitch after the country won independence in 1949. The pride is usually reflected by the conflict between reality and history, and a large amount of historic movies, individual heroism is fully displayed, which is very necessary to provoke a national pride. The second is positive image and modernization gene. You will find that actually many movies, when they talk about when they show the advanced country, they choose American as an example. The third is talk about the conflicted image. The conflict image related to the reflect to the anxious of China's rising for quite a long time, because when Chinese people tried to go abroad, they found that they try to find their place in the world. They find that the cultural conflict between Chinese and other countries are very hard in the past several years. So the fourth conversational and cooperational image related to the confidence with clear self identification with Chinese. Even now we can find that many movies, in the movies, Chinese people try to educate American. I don't know whether you know a movie called Bulletproof Monks and Forbidden Kingdom and Jackie Chan's Russian novel. In all these movies, Chinese people like to play the kung fu gurus, and all these players, American players who learn the kung fu from the gurus and try to beat with the enemies in the movies. So these four images exist in Chinese popular culture. I will finish very quickly. This is the negative image. This is ambassador in 1949. Right, transport. The second is treatment. Guasha. This is a wedding banquet. It talk about right. Is the producer is Li An, who is a very famous producer, and this is Chairman Mao meet with Madam Snow. And this is grief over the Yellow River. You see American soldier and female Balu Jun who fall into love. It's a very, I should say, it's cooperation. Right. I will very quickly to show my conclusion. The first, the U.S. image in China, China's popular culture is closely interwoven with the Sino-U.S. relationship and more standing than the diplomatic relationship. Because when we check about the three sensitive time in after the Cold War, the 1989 accident, the 1995, there is military training, military exercise, and we call the Taiwan crisis. And the 1999, the U.S. bombing Yugoslavia's embassy, and to the clash happened in South China Sea in 2001. All the movie, all the popular culture, so stable, and there are many Hollywood movies keep on going to China. They were not influenced by the diplomatic relationship. The second, the U.S. image in China's popular culture generally represents the most advanced and culture image in the world, as you know. The third is the attention China's popular culture pays to U.S. image is actually a reflection of our own image. Actually, when they try to identify Americans' image, they are trying to identify Chinese image in the world. The fourth, the U.S. image in China's culture indicated a process of diversified views on outside the culture between China's elite group and the grassroots. If you talk about different group in China, you will find that the emphasis of U.S. image are quite different. The fifth, the China's popular culture continuously recheck and re-examine its own culture image, because when they try to describe American image, actually they should find how Americans see Chinese in the movies or books. So they are recheck and re-examine themselves. The last picture is a very important picture because it raised a very huge debating in China when Li Yuchun is a supergirl. She's a supergirl who appeared in the cover of Time magazine. Many foreign correspondents took this issue as Chinese grassroots democracy. But to Chinese people, especially to Chinese young generations, it likes to see it's a play. So how to check Li Yuchun's image? Actually, we are still checking out Americans' image in China. So that's it. Sorry for bothering too much time.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Robert Daly. Who has helped to shape China's image of the United States by starring in Chinese television dramas.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Roy, and thank you to the Kissinger Institute. In thinking about today's topic and about the whole conference, my jumping off point was the same as Tian Wei's, and actually Professor Zhou made the same point about complexity. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the physician, poet, and father of the Supreme Court Justice, said that relations between two actors actually involve 6 persons. Each actor's self-image, each actor's image of the other, and what each actor actually is. So schematically, of course, those 6 people, or persons, or actors yield 15 one-on-one relations. And then if we look at all of the possible relations of 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 persons, there are a total possibly 32,767 combinations. But of course, that is too simple because we could have relations of 4, 3, 2, and 1 persons simultaneously. And it is too simple yet again because Oliver Wendell Holmes' original scheme assumes that our self-images are singular instead of plural, and that our images of the other are unified instead of diverse. And of course, we can debate whether there is any such thing as what each actor actually is. So this is just to say that our topic today is vastly complex, so we have to approach it with some humility. My comments today are tentative. China, as you know, is changing very, very fast, and having been engaged with it for 25 years, and having made numerous pronouncements about it, but China has forced me to take back about 90% of them. So these are my views as of this afternoon. My question is, how does the popular culture of the People's Republic of China influence American perceptions of that country? The short answer to the question is that the popular culture of the PRC holds scant attraction for Americans so far, and therefore it has very little influence on American perceptions of China. I'm sorry if that seems like a discourteous view. It flies in the face of the fact that China has an extremely active popular culture. Television, movies, film. China easily has the volume of these cultural products that America has. Perhaps it has even more. I do not mean to suggest that there is nothing going on in China culturally. There is a great deal going on, more than anybody can possibly absorb. My point for now is just that Americans don't show much interest in it. No television program Chinese television program has yet made any mark in the United States. Chinese film had an art house following in the 80s and 90s, a small following, primarily thanks to the work of Zhang Yimou, Chen Kaige, and Tian Zhuangzhuang. The American director Martin Scorsese said that Tian Zhuangzhuang's movie The Horse Thief was the best film anywhere in the world in the 1990s. That was recognized, but the movie was not widely viewed. So neither television nor, since really 2002 with Zhang Yimou's Hero, does Chinese film have much of a voice in the United States. And even when you did have some popular films, their reception in the United States and the perceptions they generated were primarily political. Initially, Americans, while many of these films are very fine films, but we were interested in discovering that directors and actors and screenwriters had the space at all in China to create these worthwhile films. And then I think secondarily, the response to the films was not as strong as to as our response was to the process of making the films. No movie came from China had as big an impact on us in general in America as news that a director's work had been banned, or it couldn't be shown in China, that it couldn't be shown at an international film festival, or in some cases that directors had been forbidden to make films at all. I think that political news had a stronger impact on our perceptions than the films themselves had. So the politics of filmmaking trumps, in general, the entertainment value of Chinese film in shaping American views of China. And I think something like this is true across the spectrum of other popular cultural products. Music. No Chinese melody has yet made it to the radio in America or been covered by an American musician. Sometimes Americans like American versions of songs or television shows, so they steal them. They rewrite them but use the same melody. As in 1963, the Japanese pop song Sukiyaki was #1 on the Billboard charts in Japanese. The week before that, it was It's My Party, and after that, it was Easier Said Than Done. And right in the middle, we have a Japanese pop song. No Chinese song has yet achieved that. Chinese theater, likewise, I would say, without voice or influence in the United States to date. Chinese literature, books, I think that the impact is still slight. Few Americans, even those I think who follow international literature, could name a Chinese fiction writer who resides in China. This is a picture of Lang Lang, who's popular in the United States, but I think probably more as a technician. His coming here and playing has not made Americans more interested in Chinese music. Generally, he's a performer. In the area of writing, Gao Xingjian, the gentleman on the left, won the Nobel Prize for Soul Mountain, and Ha Jin on the right has won a PEN/Faulkner Award for Waiting, but Gao has lived in Paris since 1987, and Ha, who writes primarily in English, has been in the United States since 1986. And again, are these works received primarily on their own artistic merits or as evidence of political conditions in China? My own sense, subjective, is that the exile of these two writers, the well-known exile, and in particular the Chinese bureaucracy's hostility to Gao, probably have a stronger impact on Americans who follow world literature than do the works of either man. So the narrative arts, films, teleplays, novels, I would include drama and lyrics, librettos, still have a nearly indiscernible presence in the United States. The visual arts fare somewhat better. Chinese paintings go for high prices in New York's top galleries, as we know, and Chinese aesthetics, Chinese design has an influence on American fashion, furniture, packaging, and also garden design, much as they did in the 17th and 18th centuries during the period that was known as the Chinoiserie period, in which elements of Chinese visual culture came to America, usually predigested and transformed by Japan and Europe, but they nevertheless retained an element from China. But most of this influence, whether it's fashion, Mandarin collars, Qipao, Shanghai Tang, which is, of course, a Hong Kong company, on Fifth Avenue in New York, or Chinese characters tattooed on Allen Iverson's neck and almost every part of every other person in the NBA. These are mostly, they derive from Chinese traditional culture rather than contemporary popular culture, and they are primarily limited to the realm of decoration. They have very little influence on American thought. They are skin deep, as this picture shows. So, to put it starkly, I hadn't planned to say that, I apologize. there is really nothing new or contemporary in Chinese culture from which Americans draw inspiration or that shape American views of China. This despite the fact that Americans have long been in China's cultural debt. We don't always acknowledge this to the degree that we should. Chinese traditional culture has had a varied and profound influence in America. Just a few quick examples. When Jefferson designed Monticello, the fences, the openwork you see on the wood, he did quite self-consciously in imitation of what he thought Chinese fences were like. The avenue of mulberry trees that he planted. Mulberry is one of the gifts of China to the rest of the world, including America, as is the state bird of South Dakota. You'd think you can't get much more American than that, but China, which is the land of pheasants, 57 different varieties, gives us what I grew up thinking of as a very American bird that we actually brought here, China to Europe, and then here as a game bird. We wanted to shoot it. Famously, the poetry of Ezra Pound, of E.E. Cummings, of William Carlos Williams was profoundly influenced by what they understood about Chinese poetry. A lot has been written about how much they really understood. And again, many of their views of Chinese poetry came to them by way of Japan and Japanese influences. This was true also for American painters like Whistler, whose paintings are celebrated here in the Freer Gallery. And of course, our debt to Chinese food, not necessarily Panda Express, but I wanted to show how it shapes American mall culture and architecture. Our debt to China is great. But it is still striking, I think, when we sit down here to ask this question, that despite its successes, China is in the midst of what in my paper I call a rise without shine. China has an increase in standards of living, educational attainment, and commercial and political power that is unaccompanied by the cultural flowering that should be expected from a nation whose cultural attainments in the past are unsurpassed. Why is this the case? Why do we see a failure for Chinese culture, great as it has been historically, to flower in contemporary times? A lot of my Chinese friends tell me that the reason Chinese popular culture has no presence in the United States is that Americans are not receptive to it. Americans won't welcome it, can't welcome it. I would agree that America's appetite for foreign entertainment and ideas cannot compare to that of China. I greatly admire the receptivity of China, the willingness to watch television series subtitled, the willingness to learn English and to welcome in cultural influences from all over the world is one of China's very greatest strengths. But I would say that America is not unreceptive to China. In fact, that the evidence of an American fascination with China is real and it is growing. If you just walk into any Barnes & Noble bookstore and look at the China section, you will see ample evidence that we are interested not only in Chinese history, but in economic policy and current events, but also in Chinese culture. Books, for example, on feng shui abound. Tai Chi, Chinese medicine, self-help books. Many endless translations of The Art of War, which everybody seems to read. These influences are at times admittedly shallow, but this is, of course, Elizabeth Economy of the Council on Foreign Relations, reading Sun Tzu. But the number of magazine articles and newspaper stories, websites that you see in America that are dedicated to China is growing very fast. The vogue, the rush to create Confucius Institutes, to build China Garden, and I think most importantly, the rising enrollment across America in Chinese language and culture classes. Very important and a very positive development. These things put the lie to the claim that Americans don't want to understand China. I think the evidence is ample that we do. But most interpretations of China that Americans receive come from American, not Chinese, artists and entertainers. And you noted this in China as well. In America, I think that children's culture is very important. We have Sagwa, the Chinese Siamese cat, the most popular television program of the Sesame Workshop. We have Ni Hao Kailan, which is a Nickelodeon program, and you can see the Chinese visual influence here as well. These two very popular children's television programs both self-consciously try to transmit Chinese values, or what are called Chinese values, and have a wholly positive view of China. And Ni Hao Kailan also teaches Chinese words as well. Chinese American children's books have always had a strong interest in China. The story about Ping, 1933, I grew up on. The Five Chinese Brothers, these are older books. One of the first books that Maurice Sendak, who did Where the Wild Things Are, ever illustrated was The House of 60 Fathers. Terrific book that won the Newbery Award. Rikki Tikki Tembo, 1968. Up to the current day when we have Ed Young, a Chinese-American who has produced Caldecott Medal. This is a medal for the best illustrated children's books, retellings of Chinese folk tales. Very, very popular. For older kids, The Simpsons went to China. There have been 2 South Park episodes, arguably 3 if you include Big Trouble in Little South Park, dedicated to China, but I didn't find any image that I could show at the Wilson Center for South Park. Obviously, this year's remake of The Karate Kid, again with a Chinese karate guru, but that paints a very affectionate and quite accurate portrait of Beijing, puts the American old kids classic in China. Seinfeld had 3 episodes that were China-centric and many other references to China. The Tape, the Chinese restaurant here with the maitre d' who doesn't give out seats, and then The Chinese Woman, about an American woman whose last name is Chang, but who is not Chinese, but creates the impression that she is because people then attribute to her wisdom and sexual allure, a very positive image of China. So our popular culture is rife with references for China. 1987, opera, Nixon in China. Here we have Dr. Kissinger singing and dancing with President Nixon and Zhou Enlai, a very popular opera. Broadway stage, M. Butterfly, 1988, a China story. Marvel Comics, superheroes, has a Chinese superhero, Jubilee, who has fireworks powers. Rock music, 2008 Guns N' Roses album Chinese Democracy, which didn't really have anything to do with Chinese democracy, but it was interesting that they thought that would sell albums. And at museums, last year, one of the biggest shows 2 years ago in this area, the Maryland Science Center, Chinosaurs. The list goes on and on. These are just a few samples to show you America's interest. One of my favorites, 2009, the Washington Post's annual Marshmallow Peep Diorama Contest had 3 China winners, one for the Olympics and one for the terracotta peeps. I don't expect our China guests to understand this entirely, but it was even at this level. China is on American minds. And in the absence of Chinese representations of China, I would argue that in American popular culture, for the most part, American artists and entertainers are presenting China in a fairly positive light. Affectionate, yes, critical, ironic, silly, slapstick, but positive. There are exceptions. Jack Bauer in 24 spends a year in a Chinese prison being tortured. We may see the release later this year of a remake of Red Dawn with China invading and occupying the United States. So Americans do welcome American pop cultural presentations of China, but have little interest in Chinese popular culture. Are there other explanations? Could it be that the language barrier, or political hostility, or simple inability to appreciate foreign styles and viewpoints account for our lack of interest in Chinese popular culture? I would argue no, and as evidence point to the record of Japanese popular culture here in America. The films of Kurosawa and Miyazaki, very popular here. Did I have the right? Yeah. This one, Toy Story 3, has a call out to Miyazaki with his character on the right from My Friend Totoro, who shows up with the Toy Story toys. His Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, are part of childhood in America now. Americans have always been interested in Japanese fiction, Tanizaki, Endo, Muramaki, Banana Yashimoto more recently. Children's culture. Nintendo rules American childhood now. Pokemon, Mario Brothers, recently the Pokemon games. Now all the kids in my neighborhood play with Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Japanese anime. Americans are not thoroughgoing cultural xenophobes. There is an issue. We could do better, but I think that the record of Japanese culture here shows that we are open. We cannot ascribe then American disinterest in Chinese popular culture to disinterest in China, for our interest in China is very high, or to cultural xenophobia, which I say is real but not dominant. The English title of my paper, which you can read later if you like, is Arise Without Shine, The Global Weakness of Chinese Culture. The Chinese title is 取成水不到. This is my Chinese title. And this title turns around the Chinese phrase 水到渠成 to suggest that the failure of Chinese popular culture in America may lie in part with Chinese culture itself. 水到渠成 is an old saying that means that you see a plain where there's no apparent channel for water to flow through, but if the floodwaters come, water finds its channel. And it means that a way will appear when conditions are ripe. And I flip it and say 渠成水不到 to say conditions are ripe. Americans are interested, deeply interested in China. The channels are clear, but the water isn't flowing. Why? An answer was provided by the Chinese blogger, race car driver, rock star Han Han on May 20th of this year, 2010, at Xiamen University in his speech, which was titled, Why China Cannot Be a Cultural Power. And his answer was censorship, which we talked about a little bit earlier this morning. Censorship, I would argue, and China's acclimatization to censorship prevents Chinese popular culture from attracting and influencing American audiences. Americans will respond to fictional characters, to songwriters whose psychologies, whose dilemmas are different from their own, but they will not respond to characters who seem constrained by forces that are external to the novel or the song, namely by the hand of the state in general. So this price, I think that the global price that China pays for censorship is quite high even from Beijing's point of view, in that the absence in America of creative voices from China itself leaves the field to the media, to current events, to cultural commentators from academia, and from other sources. And I think that this hurts our understanding of and appreciation for China. I think that if we had the novels, the songs, the films that were not subject to censorship, to risk a grand phrase, what happens when you have real cultural exchange is that you more fully discover the humanity of the other. That's what it does. And that is conducive generally to sympathy, to greater sympathy than you have. And in the absence of works that can do that, the news cycle tends to dominate American perceptions of China. It yields the ground. Just in closing, this is not only my point of view. There is, as some of our earlier speakers have mentioned, a debate within China itself about these matters. This is not news to the Chinese guests. And to pick up on the point about complexity in the media, last week's Liaowang Dongfang Zhoukan, Oriental Outlook Weekly, published by the Xinhua News Agency, the cover story is features a bunch of glamour shots of the Chinese special forces. But on page 7 is an editorial by the editors of Xinhua, who are themselves involved in censorship. And I've translated the article in its entirety, and it's available outside if you're interested. I did a translation for this conference with the Chinese. But at the end of the article, they conclude by writing this. Again, the editors of Xinhua, this is official Chinese voice. A few years ago, relevant authorities raised the issue of China's cultural deficit. Compared to China's continuing annual foreign trade surplus, China's trade in cultural products is indeed in serious deficit. If we want to change China's deficit in cultural products, we must liberate and enliven our cultural productivity. And this in turn depends upon our cultural management bureaus truly transforming their functions by separating cultural management from cultural production, issuing fewer prohibitions, and offering more service. Most importantly, the Constitution must be strictly adhered to, the limitations of powers must be clearly defined in accordance with the Constitution and with the spirit and principles of law, and prohibition should not be flailed like knives in the face of cultural markets at every turn. Cultural production is inseparable from the energy of the people. In order to give the greatest possible scope to the cultural creativity of the entire society, an environment for the cultural sector built on the rule of law and not the rule of man must be guaranteed. Only if healthy, vigorous cultural markets are built through the rule of law, and if cultural production becomes more specialized and standardized, can China's cultural sector be truly strong and competitive. So saying very much what I've said from a slightly different angle and under different constraints, but I see these cries as coming from a recognition that China, as a contemporary center for culture, has so much to offer. I look forward to and welcome the day when we might all benefit from that. Thank you very much.
I think we've had two excellent presentations to which we could devote a conference in itself. There's so many interesting issues that have been raised about what shapes our perceptions of each other. But we have 10 minutes, and I'd like to provide an opportunity for people to raise questions. Let's start over here against the wall.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. Bob, I think you give some interpretation of what happened, but I would like to add something more.
Sure.
I think most important, first thing, is the language. And second thing is West and East is quite different culture. And the last one should be most important. You can look at the history. Last 100 years, Sun Yat-sen called China is a sub-colonized state. That means usually you only one country colonize another one country. But China is colonized by so many countries. And then become, it's really a cultural desert. Mm-hmm. And also, it's discontinued civilization. Nowadays, China don't know their own philosophy, their own culture. So that's what it is. I think only after this China fail, have water and have growth, then something will be different. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions? Here's a, Michael, here's someone against the wall here.
Thank you, Dave Rabinowitz. I was wondering if the works of Amy Tan or similar authors have been published in China and what the reaction to that has been.
Actually, I'm not very clearly examined the Joint Club, the movie, but I should give you another examination to talk about this kind of movie. Some movies market actually is abroad. So when Chinese people talk about Joint Club and the movie, actually I think most of the audience are the elite, or some people who cared about the Chinese image abroad. So I don't think this movie is quite popular in Chinese, common cultures. But there is, I think they also have some cultural conflict between two nations in this kind of movie. Let me give you another example. This is Wedding Banquet, which was popular in China to talk about American image. A son who bring his boyfriend back. So this is the shock to his father. At the end of this movie, many Chinese watcher or commentators noticed a detail. The father raised his hands to say goodbye to his son, but looks like a surrender. So this is like the culture's conflict, and it is a symbolic of the culture's conflict. So I think when we talk about this kind of movie, actually we are talking about we will pay attention on the on the cultural conflict in this kind of movie. I don't know whether I answered the question.
Have the books appeared in China in translation? Or
Yes. Joy Club has. And I would second what Professor Zhou said. It was not seen as a very important book and was mostly read not as a work of literature, but as something that might say something about how Americans look at China, into these meta levels of perceptions fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. Let's take here. Terry, I'll get you later. But
Paul Eckert from Reuters news agency, and I had the privilege of being a correspondent in China from 1996 to 2001, during which time I befriended a few rockers in China, including Cui Jian. And they were very approachable. And the one thing that struck me about musicians in China is they had a hard time making a good living because of the piracy. And of course, that's a huge complaint from our side of the ocean, trying to sell product to China, movies or otherwise. And I'm just wondering if, especially Professor Daly, if you had any thoughts on whether the growth of Chinese literature to the scale that might make it more of a global force or a force with us in North America, to what extent it might be inhibited by the inability to get a return on their work, musically or otherwise.
It's certainly a factor. I would say that it's secondary. There are many factors, obviously, other than censorship. I think that that's the single most important, censorship and acclimatization of various sorts to censorship. But yes, beyond that, the musicians in particular have a hard time, although they're still producing a great deal of music that is played in radio stations, and there's a lot of interest in it. So I'm not sure that may prevent certain kinds of amounts of output, but I don't think that per se prevents certain kinds of content or prevents the creation of memorable jingles or melodies, which was more the point that I was making. But yes, I think that the copyright question is going to come to the fore more as censorship pressures recede, assuming they do. Yes.
Just to add to that, when I was the ambassador in Beijing, I had a lunch with a group of Chinese movie directors, and there was very frank discussion over lunch. In certain fields, they felt that basically they could do what they wanted, but there were certain types of TV films, for example, where because of the piracy, there were simply no commercial opportunities in it, and as a result, at that time, they simply weren't producing anything in those areas. So the copyright issue does affect what you can produce if it depends on commercialization as a way of attracting artists to those fields. Yeah. Ellen?
Ellen Frost. Professor Joe, you said something fascinating, and I wonder if you would elaborate on it. You said that Chinese perceptions of the United States were a projection of Chinese images of themselves, and I wonder if you could illustrate that or explain it a bit more.
Yeah, okay. Let me just add something. For example, if you talk about the cover story about Li Yuchun in Time Magazine Asia edition in 2006 or 2005 or 2006, I think, at that time. Actually, the American media try to describe Chinese young generations, but when this cover story raised a topic in China, it caused another issue to talk about what Americans' role in Chinese modernization and how American media plays in China's modern culture. So many people think that Li Yuchun she is important because she was emphasized by some foreign culture watcher, take it as example of Chinese culture. So it means that the Chinese culture development very quickly, and even Chinese young generation stand out of join the core of the play for the recent years. So at that time, Chinese people are calculate, or we said Chinese mass media, Chinese mass culture calculate their distance with American culture. They try to make some foreign proof or foreign evidence to prove that Chinese culture also advanced and Chinese culture also modern. Because when we talk about Chinese culture, actually we are talking about the Great Wall of Forbidden City. Even during the Olympics, when you see the short movie of Olympics, all the beginning begins from the door of Forbidden City opens, and it looks like the too much traditional symbol in China. But when Chinese culture want to dialogue with outside world, they should join the dialogue. They should have the confidence to join the dialogue. How to get the confidence? They try to get confidence from the Americans' image.
Terry, this is the last question, and we're ready for our break.
Thank you. Terry Lott, Syracuse University. Professor Joe, a couple of quick questions, easy questions. One is, I'm wondering to what extent Chinese audiences appreciate the fact that popular culture is full of cliches and stereotypes and generalizations. There's a lot of distortion in any interpretation of popular culture. I'm a little concerned because if this is the main vehicle for Chinese to understand the United States, then I think it may raise as many questions as it answers. A friend recently took a high-ranking Chinese officer to see the movie Avatar here in the United States, and after the movie, the Chinese general said, "This is true American genius." And I think it does reflect certain preconceptions or ideas about American ability to in science and technology. But I'm wondering if Chinese audiences go beyond that. My second question is Chinese popular perceptions of race, and specifically, how was the election of President Obama interpreted or received in China? Was it a big surprise?
Actually, it's not a simple question.
Can you give a brief answer?
Right. I should begin with the second question. I don't think Obama's issue belongs to popular culture. It belongs to political or belongs to much more serious perception. But the popular culture can deconstruct it, the serious issue, to make any people, whenever elites or, like I said, grassroots, to have their own idea about Americans' political system and Americans' president. So when there is when the picture appeared, actually we see two very clear symbols. One, Obama is very important in the relationship between two countries. So they raise Obama in the bag or in the picture. The second, Obama should combined with Chinese culture. So you see Obama wear the very typical PLA's cap. So, but frankly speaking, I don't think it's very, Obama is very popular in Chinese culture. Chinese culture like to talk about Nicolas Cage, to talk about Brad Pitt. That's what worries me. The first question talk about. I think there is a very important reason in Chinese popular culture to understand American image. That's business. So the market of popular culture growing very quickly, and based on this market, Chinese people like to understand the foreigners much more than themselves. For example, I give you a very simple example. We're talking about Iron Man. Actually, at that time, when Americans' movie Iron Man was broadcasting in Chinese cinemas, there is another Iron Man, which was Chinese domestic movie, talking about Wang Jingxi. I don't know whether you know him. He's a very famous worker in the northeast. But if you watch the income of two movies, you will find that American's Iron Man is much more popular than Chinese Iron Man at that in that month. This is because of the business, because of advertisement, because of the introduction, because of all the magazines and all the aspects who joined the popular culture's discussion. So, my answer is that.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a 15-minute break, and then Professor Sun Zhou will be in the chair for the final session this afternoon.
Wasn't the American Iron Man also more entertaining?
Yes.
Right. I mean, that's important, right? It's not just...
Well, it's not just advertising. It's
right. There's
has to do with the entertainment.
Yes.
It's a big issue. It's a big issue.
Thank you.
Well, it's one that needs to be looked at because the emphasis.
Sorry it was a little rushed. I tend to over-prepare, and these are complicated questions. So I can give you my paper to you, the full paper, which isn't out yet, but I will send it to this email.
Your generation uses that.
Sir, John Sands with CTI TV.
Actually, I'm sorry we didn't have time to talk about language, because I agree that the language is the single most important. 而且我们这样的那个研讨会应该是中文一个，英文一个，都是英文也不太好。It's very true. No? Rosa NTC at Hotmail. I will send the paper to you, and then a copy of the original Chinese article and my translation of it from this magazine. I think are out there now. Out there, yeah. I finished it last night. Grab whatever you want. We can always print more.
I think you don't remember me.
I do remember you. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, you still want me coming?
We've got. Did you ever send me a list of topics? You sent me your CV, but did you send a list of topics?
Any topic you want.
Well, it can't be any. That's too much. It can't be any topic. I need a list of specific topics, because we do have a lot of groups coming in. Hi. Hey, Robert.
I found your remarks really interesting, particularly because as I was thinking, as we were talking, I think Taiwan has been a lot more successful than China.
And Hong Kong. Sure.
So that is very interesting, given what you were saying about censorship and the way that's impacted.
And that's what you can see. I mean, you see a movie like Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. Absolutely gorgeous romantic comedy, Chinese to the core, but speaks to everybody. And that could have been made in China. It's not just censorship. There are other reasons. Hong Kong. So yes, I was going to mention that, but I didn't want it to feel like a pile-on, especially because Jim Fallows had made some of the same points. But yes, I think that supports what I'm saying about it. Is the fact that it's not Chinese culture per se.
Robert, I'd like to ask you a question about the receptivity in China to documentaries that have been done. For example, there was one called Up the Yangtze, a Canadian filmmaker, and I saw it and talked with the director. They had to film it basically sub rosa, but it was about a village that was being inundated by the Gorgon Dam.
Right.
And the daughter had to go to work on a cruise ship. Perfectly, straightforward story. I don't know. He said that it would probably not be shown in China.
But see, the answer is that you can't know, because it almost certainly wouldn't be shown in a Chinese theater or on a television set. But everything can be seen in bootleg DVDs, and very often is. So, what would the receptivity be is very hard to know. You can't judge, you can't answer that in real terms just based on the fact that it can't be shown on the official media. You'd have to know what goes on underground, and you can't know that, so it's hard to answer.
Yeah. The same thing is true about a documentary called Unnatural Disaster about the Shoddy school construction.
Right.
That was made here. They were in China filming.
Right, but again, with chest-mounted cameras or on the sly somehow. And again, how much of this stuff gets seen there and how? Hard to know. Sure.
Thanks very much.
I feel like exchange cards.
Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed
old
the
friend.
presentation. Now, your paper that you talked about, is it out here? Or is
They don't have the papers yet, but I will email it to you. I'll send it tonight.
You're right at the main campus here at College Park?
Yes, I am. Yep.
I've been interested in the whole notion of, or the absence of Chinese soft power, or the absence thereof, by which I mean TRC soft power. So
Right.
maybe I can explore that.
Well, see, and this is what there's been a lot of loose talk about China's. There are elements of Chinese soft power that are rising, but not enough has been said about the fact that censored art is always going to be less competitive or attractive in a free cultural market.
Tying their hands behind their own backs.
And I don't think we do anybody any favors by being polite and not mentioning it. So I apologize if this was a little too abrupt. But
I've tended to formulate myself as China having a soft culture, but PRC China not really having that.
why don't we get out of there? They've got to set up.
other the criminal conviction requires beyond a reasonable doubt. But this civil forfeiture is decided by the research stage. I would not like to see this practice unless convictions. That's probably a minority view of American law, but it offends me. I think people are having property taken away from them because of their involvement in crimes that they didn't commit. I happen to think these people did. I think the Chuns are doing this various things. It hasn't been funny. This crime doesn't seem to bother some of my colleagues in the war.
Thank you.
Do you want any water?
I can use this cup. Thank you.
You're more moderate, you see?
It's rather be far left than far right, right?
Some respects. Hi. How are you? Human rights, first of all, there's an enormous.
Don't need a new one?
15到20分钟。好了，那个别太严肃啊。好。那个15到20 minutes.
15到20分，20分。
Get more time. Okay. Discussion. Yeah.
Also bans people like President I'm sorry. I worry about
啊，我现在
他马上是我知道后面就照你这样讲。
我主持，我不是来，哎，我们
过来了，他说他要跟你谈。
对，我等一下。
我跟他约个时间吧，明天下午或者星期三早晨约个时间吧，让他到饭店来谈。
行，啊，他
今天下午因为没什么安排，
他谈什么呢？
谈那个高官培训，他不是还想说了？
对，
他是在问一下意见。他刚才跟我说，您跟他说要把那个什么卡内基也拉进来。我说
我没说呀。
是啊，我说你千万别拉卡内基，这个本来我们现在做的挺好的，
我没说呀。
什么抛汉了再拉进来？
我没说呀。
所以他跑到跟抛汉了去谈去了。我说跟抛汉了
跟我没关系。
对呀，跟我们中心一点关系都没有。
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please take a seat. We'll begin. Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, where do I sit?
I'm taking your seat. Sorry. Can you do me a favor? Move.
I'm not using a computer.
See,
You use a computer?
okay. No, I'm not using computer.
But Dean Wang.
Dean Wang use.
Like musical chairs, I lost them.
要不我坐这儿。
Look forward to hearing.
Yes. 我就坐这儿才。Celebrating your birthday, right?
Yes, it goes on like a Polish wedding.
第一个是Jerry.
It's not over.
Not over yet.
那一会儿你给他换个位置。
不用换，我还用这个。
啊 ，OK。
Interesting.
Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have 4 distinguished speakers in this session. We'll begin with a discussion of differing conception of the rule of law, how and why. I'll begin with one of the founding fathers of study in this discipline. Jerry, you first, please. Please, 15 to 20 minutes, because we want, 20. You know how to bargain.
Well, I want to say I have really enjoyed this conference so far, especially listening to so many of the younger experts from China.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it on now?
Yes.
Yeah. I say I've really enjoyed the conference, especially listening to so many of the younger experts from China who are articulate, analytical, and even humorous. So far, so good. And my chairman, Yinggai Ting Lingdao, you always have to listen to the leadership. My chairman has instructed me to try to be equally humorous because he's afraid otherwise you'll be falling asleep. So I'll do my best. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk with my great friend, Dean Wang Junmin. I've known him for many years. We've cooperated on many projects. I taught at his law school part-time for 4 years. His wife was my student at NYU Law School. We're good friends, and we have the pleasure of exchanging frank views, occasionally even in public. For him, this is not merely an academic question, although he is an academic. That's his main livelihood. He has to face very real non-academic problems because he's the bridge between party pressures, political reality, and legal education, and the desire of many people in China to have a rule of law. And he's put his money where his mouth is. He's devoted his life to this. This is a great topic we've been assigned today. It should have a year's seminar. It should have a book. Maybe eventually it will. Maybe I'll get Dean Wang to come and join me. And we can talk as his predecessor joined me in giving a course about law and society in Taiwan. Now, we have, of course, some differences in conception of law. But we have to figure out how to get a grip on this subject because it's far from simple. First of all, in China, despite the party line on any given subject, and it's very important on our subject of this afternoon, there are diverse views. I was delighted in Chinese legal education to hear so much dialogue and difference of views. Although in Chinese legal education it should be known that most law professors, I haven't done the kind of surveys we've been exposed to by our political scientists, but my impressions are most law teachers in China are really impressed by so-called Western legal values, whatever they happen to be, when we'll talk about that. And not only do they preach and write about things from that point of view, but many Chinese law professors are real activists. Their influence in Chinese legal development is greater than that of American law professors. We like to think we're important to American society, but they're more important, relatively speaking, in China, and certainly more important in their influence than Chinese lawyers. Whereas in America, the legal profession, the American Bar Association, and groups like that are more important than the law professors in China. It's the opposite. And they're at variance in many respects with the party line. Since the 17th Party Congress, almost 3 years ago, as most of you know, the party line has become more conservative in many respects, affecting not only the legal system, but the media. And many legal professionals, and here I mean not only the law professors and the lawyers, but many, not all, but many judges, prosecutors, officials, legislative experts, Many of them are unhappy with the last 2.5 years of the line. And in their way, they try to make the best of the situation, to limit the damage, in the hope that 2012 will bring a restoration of movement. And of course, we talk about perceptions or conceptions of law. There are other people in China besides the party people and besides the legal experts. You have migrant laborers, and you have lots of people who feel dispossessed, people who feel powerless, people who are under or unemployed. What I would call in French terms the déracinés, the uprooted. We associate the growth of law in the West with the rising bourgeoisie, who try to protect their property interests against the depredations of the nobility and the king. But in China, I don't think the rising bourgeoisie, the Jia, the entrepreneurs, are the ones who are pushing the rule of law. They're doing well. They're the principal beneficiaries with officialdom of China's phenomenal prosperity. And they can rely on other things. They don't need to rely on making legal claims. They have money. They have guanxi, political as well as personal connections. The people who really need law, as some of our political scientists have pointed out, are the people who don't have money, who don't have connections, who aren't the winners but the losers in China's phenomenal development. They're the ones who make the claims. Law is, as Mary Gallagher once put it, their weapon, and that's all they've got. So you have differences in views in China, and there is a continuing struggle. It's not like there's just a party line out there and everybody falls into step behind it. And it's not like it's over until 2012, because every day these new overlapping legal elites in China who didn't exist 30 years ago, they're making decisions, they're negotiating, they're trying to do things, they're trying to enact progressive rules, and sometimes they can still do it. Right now you have 170,000 lawyers, more or less. You have roughly 200,000 judges, almost as many prosecutors. You have large numbers of law professors. Hundreds of thousands of students of law are going to take the bar exam this year, as every year. You have all kinds of officials. You have lawyers in corporations and every government agency. They don't all agree on everything, but there is a kind of a technical, legal group, overlapping groups, that are increasingly restive, increasingly desirous of creating something that deserves the name of the rule of law. Now, in the West, this is interesting, because sophisticated Chinese observers know, in many senses, there is no West. Certainly not geographically. What is the West? Is it in law? Is it the U.S., the UK, France, Germany, Japan, India, Taiwan, South Korea? See, the West is a state of mind, and yet the West is various. Generally speaking, when it comes to law, you have two major groups, as you know. The Anglo-American system and the continental European system. And each has had a major mark on many countries of the world. Germany became the classic standard bearer for continental European law based on its modern achievements at the end of the 19th century, the Bismarck Constitution and the legislation, Civil Code of Germany, for example. By 1900, it was a model for many countries, especially in Asia. So the West is different. Also, the West is evolving. Not only within the West are all these countries quite distinctive one from another, but they're changing. And look at Germany. It was the classic model until Hitler. Then the Nazis took over and distorted the German legal system. And then after the war, as a result of the terrible defeat, denazification, Germany began to pay more attention to the human rights, political power aspects of law, not only the commercial aspects. And the German changes in the inquisitorial system, for example, that have been the inquisitorial system that's so influential in China today, as well as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, etc., that inquisitorial system has been modified very significantly to respect human rights more than it originally did, and to come closer to the Anglo-American system, which itself has been changing. The UK system has been changing just in recent years, just as the US system has been changing, or at least struggling how to change. And look at today's front page story on the Washington Post. In the Washington Post, and you'll see this is an ongoing struggle in every country. How do you attain the rule of law, and what do you mean by it? So when we say China is different from the West, we have to know a little more what we're talking about. But the West does exist. Law is increasingly homogenized because of globalization. Not only commercial law, foreign investment protection, all the things China has learned in the last 30 years, and China has created a very nice environment by and large in principle for laws, regulations to welcome foreign investors. How it uses it, you get complaints over time, as you do now, but China's mastered that. But now with respect to public law, there is also a Western consensus, even though the West is so varied. And what is that consensus? First of all, there should be a constitution that allocates power among government agencies and outlines the relations of government agencies to individuals and entities, etc. Second, that constitution should be enforced. There should be some mechanism that makes it part of the nation's living law, not just something you look at occasionally for political propaganda or other ideological purposes. Third, there is a consensus that when government has to punish somebody, government should observe certain basic decencies in the name of what we say in America, due process. You could call it fundamental fairness, that government should act in a way that treats the individual with respect. And this gets on to what we'll talk about in the morning, the individual versus the group, etc., the distinctiveness of certain Western countries, political history, etc. Now, these decencies include the right to defend yourself, have a genuine opportunity to defend yourself, and the presumption of innocence before a decision maker who's impartial and able to make a decision and independent of extraneous political or other influences. Witnesses should appear. You shouldn't be condemned by rumor or by somebody's written report that can never be questioned. Somebody should appear in court if they're going to use evidence against you. And you should have a right to cross-examine them to ascertain the accuracy of what they're saying. Of course, torture should not be used against people who are under investigation, and evidence coerced by torture, mental as well as physical, should not be used in their conviction. The trial should generally be open, so judges and prosecutors and others can be held to public account, and so knowledge of the legal system can be spread. Some form of popular participation should be recognized in the administration of justice. That's the most difficult thing. And China has recognized that for a long time, in certain respects, introducing some recent notions that even use the term jury trial in certain Chinese provinces. But Japan has introduced a criminal jury. So has South Korea. Taiwan has not. And you can see the political implications of introducing a jury trial. Would Chen Shui-bian have been convicted? Whatever the great evidence against him, and I think he's very corrupt, but would he have been convicted if you had a fairly chosen body of 12 people who were representatives of the community? Wouldn't there be one person who said, I refuse to convict him, whether the evidence requires it or not? What we call in America jury nullification. Some people feel so strongly they don't give a damn about the evidence. They're not going to vote to convict for historical, personal, political, or whatever reasons. So there's got to be a basic opportunity for a fair trial and review. Moreover, once you construct this kind of a nice model system that reflects many international documents, you shouldn't have some easy way out by having an alternative to that system. What good is it to put in 20 wonderful preventions against arbitrary government if the police can say, we won't use the courts, we'll give him administrative punishment, and no prosecutor will review what we do, no court will have to approve it, we'll do it. Give him 3 or 4 years. That undermines the meaning of a legal system if you allow that. Another indispensable element, as I said to some of you today, is you must have free media. If you don't have free media able to report the abuses that every legal system has, including our own here, you can't have a real rule of law. In New York City and Washington, D.C., we know every day police will commit abuses. Sometimes not intentionally, sometimes intentionally. But we also know that once those things get reported in the newspaper, there is a political process generated to try to cure them, and over time, sometimes quickly, sometimes not, reforms will take place. Apologies will be made. Compensation will sometimes be dispensed to the victim, etc. And that gets to the last prerequisite. You must have some form of political arrangement. It doesn't have to be a democratically elected legislature, but it has to be something to which the media can go, to which citizenry can go and say, you've got to improve things. You've got to amend the law. You may have to change the Constitution. So that's the Western system, including, as I said, many Asian countries at this point. Now, it's obvious when we look at China that China hasn't got all this, even in writing, but it has much of this in writing, and it has some of this in practice. And this is what the struggle's all about. The other day, a big victory came out. The criminal justice experts in China convinced the government to enact a regulation that says in criminal procedure cases, evidence of torture may not be used. Now, they've had this principle for a long time. The problem is they've lacked the means of implementing it. And I don't know yet whether this will be faithfully implemented. There are so many obstacles to changing police habits of mind, even in our society here or in England, not to mention in China, where one big question I'll mention in a minute is the impact of tradition. Are Chinese prisoners of their own long history? Or can they really change things in practice as well as theory? Now, China now has what it didn't have in 1979. It has a formal legal system. It's got lots of laws. It has legal rules that come from bilateral and multilateral international commitments. China has adhered to over 20-odd international human rights documents. Chinese government, in the exercise of its sovereignty, has decided voluntarily to adopt these international norms. So don't let any Chinese leader say, nobody has a right to question us. The foreign ministry's spokesman every week says, no one has the right to question China's this or that. It's nonsense. China has committed itself to many international rules. And this mobilization of national Pride is often just makes no sense. China now has legal institutions of a sophisticated nature that it didn't have 30 years ago. They were just resurrecting the courts after the chaos of the Cultural Revolution and the anti-rightist movement and the Great Leap Forward. China now has personnel who've been trained by an increasingly good, huge legal education establishment. I don't know how many law schools that they have now, but last I heard, over 640.
Oh, no.
Huh? Yeah,
So many.
more now. And when I went to China for the first time in 1972, nothing was going on. 1973, I wrote in the Harvard Law School Bulletin, the first thing you have to understand about legal education in China is that there isn't any. And now it's industry, it's big stuff. And a lot of people, publishers, are making money. When I first went into the Xinhua Shudian, you couldn't find a book on law. Now everybody's making money by publishing and republishing.
Republishing, reprinting.
But the fact is, this impressive accomplishment is not allowed to operate independently in many cases. Not in all, and that's a problem. Now, in looking at legal systems, the worst kind of comparative law is to compare our theory and their practice. We have all these beautiful ideals, the Bill of Rights and all this. But if we only look to our theory and don't look how it works out in America, it's not fair. We're not comparing apples and apples, because when we look at China, we're looking to the extent we can look, given its non-transparency in many legal matters. We're trying to look how do things work. My interest is in the sociology of law. How do legal institutions interact with societies and people and governments? Now, if we talk about images, my impression is, and I'd like to hear Dean Wong on this, is that the Chinese people often give the American legal system more credit than it deserves, because they think about our ideals. And they're nice ideals, and China aspires to them also. They don't, even though we're open and transparent in most respects, they don't know enough to know our problems of race, of poverty, of post-9/11 national security concerns, of Guantanamo, of this, of that. But some of them know something. I remember doing a Voice of America call-in show. It was about criminal procedure in China and the need for reform. And after a half-hour interview, we had an hour of questions. Every question I got from China was not about China, but about America's mistreatment of Wen Ho Lee, the Chinese scientist who was badly treated, detained unfairly for 9 months by federal system, and then later received an apology after he made a modest guilty plea. So Chinese should know more about our system. And of course, we need to know more about theirs. We have a media that makes it easy for China to compile its annual criticisms of U.S. human rights situation. And I think those criticisms are useful if they're not too politically tendentious. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So what we're confronted by is a strange situation. The Chinese leadership today does not reject the so-called Western rule of law, where government is under law, but it only talks about it maybe 3 days a week. 4 days a week, it tells its people, don't take too seriously what we've been telling you on the other days. Don't take too seriously what we've written into our Constitution about human rights and property rights and all those freedoms. And don't really worry about the adversary system that we've allowed to be introduced. And don't take too seriously the propaganda about the socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics that has done so much to raise people's rights consciousness in China, so that the so-called uprooted, the less fortunate segments of society, they take this in and they want to use those ideas, and they want lawyers to help them and others. And when the petition system is such a disaster, they naturally want to look to the courts. And if the courts can't function or aren't allowed to function, this only introduces frustration and leads people like my dear blind man friend Chen Guangcheng, the barefoot lawyer who's finished 3 years in jail and will finally get out in September. He said to me before he went to jail, "What did they want us to do? I was trying to use the courts. I was trying to use the legal system. Do they want me to get out and create riots in the street?" Well, we know a lot of other people have been looking to riots in the street. All right, well, where does this opposition of the party come from? It's really based in Marxism-Leninism, adapted by Chairman Mao, etc. Of course, Marx was a Westerner. Lenin was a Westerner. He was a Russian lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer, for a brief period before he turned to more effective means. Having lost a few cases in the Tsarist courts and political cases, Lenin decided not to keep on with that, but to go into the streets. So this is the dictatorship of the proletariat with Chinese characteristics is a Western import. The sad thing is, in 1968, I published a book, Harvard Press, Criminal Process in the People's Republic of China. 42 years later, despite all the legislation, all the legal education, all the training, the new wonderful personnel, the situation hasn't really changed in practice. You still have re-education through labor, Laodong Jiaoyang, as an alternative to whatever criminal justice system people have. You still have torture. I just wrote something last night that will appear later in the week about the Xuefeng case, Chinese-American who's been convicted of exporting state secrets, and his case shows many violations of not only Chinese domestic law and procedure, but of the U.S.-China consular agreement that's supposed to protect foreigners like Xuefeng. So, what are the prospects for change? I think there are prospects for change. I mentioned progress in legal education, influence of law professors and other experts, many of the judges and prosecutors who are hoping for a better day and working toward it quietly. There is some prospect for change. The party line, however, is depressing people. As some of you know, it puts law third when it comes to deciding cases. First should be the interests of the party. Second should be the interests of the people, however defined, always by the party. And third, you think about the law and the Constitution. If you read the statement by Zhou Yongkang, the head of the political legal group, political legal commission of the Central Party apparatus that was published in Choushi magazine in February, you'll think China never had any defense lawyer system. You think you were back in the Qing dynasty. He calls for the repression. First, try to find the problems before they arise. When you find them, if you can't stamp them out, you got to use repression and do a better job of it. Police, prosecutors, and judges. But you don't know anything about, is there a defense system in China at all, despite China's progress in creating it? So there are disturbing similarities to the imperial system that lead one to ask, maybe the Chinese leaders are right when they say, we're different. We have a different civilization. But I don't believe it. First of all, China's made a lot of progress since the Qing dynasty when it comes to law. At least the leaders sometimes show feelings of guilt when they don't live up to the imported system. And I think there still are pressures for improvement. My hope is principally in what has happened in Taiwan. Because I have seen in my lifetime, Taiwan, I first visited 1961, I've seen Taiwan go from a very similar, essentially Marxist-Leninist system. Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek had the forms of European continental law, but the practice of a party state operating under Leninist lines with the equivalent of Laodong Jiaoyang for those who didn't fall within the formal legal system. I've seen it all, and I've seen it all develop in a way that some people never thought could happen. Of course, Taiwan is still struggling from, you see today, judicial corruption in some cases, although they've done a remarkable job in curbing corruption. But they have a functioning, not just legal system, but they now have a dynamic rule of law under a feisty, much too feisty, partisan political process, which makes that accomplishment even more difficult. But I see there's much to be learned. China doesn't have to follow what Taiwan has done, but Taiwan, like Japan, like South Korea, gives the answer to those who say Confucian, Buddhist, East Asian traditional political culture cannot accommodate the rule of law as it's known in the West. And it's nonsense. It's up to the leadership. One litmus test will be, will China finally ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which it signed in 1998? I don't see it with this administration, but after 2012 it could happen. That would have a profound impact, more than the impact of China joining the WTO. So that's a big hurdle. Someday there will be the top leadership in China that will call for reforms of a genuine rule of law, just the way Zhu Rongji called for reforms of the Chinese economy. Someday there'll be a leader with the brilliance and the power and the guts to take this on, because by then he'll have a lot of constituents. But you don't get to the top of a communist system by preaching the rule of law and human rights. Nobody knew in 1956 that Khrushchev was going to introduce de-Stalinization. Khrushchev was Stalin's henchman, but he hated it, being humiliated and kicked around by an arbitrary leader. And he instituted de-Stalinization that had some modest impact at the very time China was going the other way, abandoning the Soviet system for the anti-rightist movement and the Great Leap Forward. And certainly nobody knew when Gorbachev got to the #1 spot that even though he had studied law, that he was going to introduce perestroika and all that. So we don't know what the next generation or the generation after that in the Politburo Standing Committee will call for. But someday, I'm confident, it's going to happen, because the changes that are underway in Chinese society, I think, will call for it. In the meantime, when people ask, what can we do in the United States? The first thing I say is, we should do a better job of showing the world that we practice what we preach. This is very, very important. The struggle is going on today in Washington. To what extent will secret trials be allowed? To what extent will people be tried before military commissions? This is what the article in the Washington Post can tell you about, too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a really wonderful talk. But now everybody has to listen. If I give you a card, I give you 4 times. You're a law professor. He pretend he never see this. So we will learn from. Don't learn from. Let me say a couple of words. He's played a very critical role in helping drafting the Hong Kong law, and he's now still serving as the senior consultant to Office of Taiwan Affairs on the future, hopefully, cross-strait law.
Thank you. I have great time pressure. Law is very boring to non-lawyers. My speech is very much more boring. Also, I don't make a fancy PPT document. But I'm very pleased to talk with Jerry about law in U.S. and China. From my long contact with Jerry, I learned a great deal from him. Especially one time he told me how to make a great speech in the U.S. 3 principles. One is to stand. Don't sit to speak. Secondly, don't read your paper. Thirdly, to speak loudly. Nevertheless, we share a lot of same opinions on law, but also we have different opinions. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to give some basic facts of U.S. and China. First, U.S. and China have almost a similar size of land, but we have quite different population, 300 million and 1.3 billion. When we make laws, last year I was entrusted to draft the public housing law. We have to consider 1.3 billion people. In U.S., you only consider 300 million people. So no laws so far in the world history apply to 1.3 billion people. Secondly, you have 221 years history since 1789. But China has over 5,000 years history. According to the historian, China experienced 6,539 wars during the 5,000 years civilization, more than 6,000 wars. But U.S. only experienced 2 wars on U.S. Domestic land. The Independence War and also Civil War, only 2 wars. Now China, more than 6,000 wars. In China, we have a saying, 打江山, which means the nation was built by wars. The nation was built by wars. In U.S., the United States was built by negotiations, by our constitution, by law. From the outset, very beginning. Without law, without constitution, there would be no U.S., United States. But China could live without law for many years. So you can see the fundamental difference. Also, one basic fact, the U.S. presidents from Washington to Obama, 44 presidents, 70% lawyers. For the vice presidents, 76% lawyers. For the Secretary of State, 78%. 78% Secretary of State lawyers. But also a lot of governors and senators, congressmen are lawyers. But in China, we have non-lawyer in the political bureau. No, in the previous political bureau. Now we have only one lawyer. Li Keqiang. Yeah. So you can see, different facts, different backgrounds. I will brief the traditional concepts on law amongst the Chinese general public. Law is not something new to Chinese people. China had a long legal history. Every dynasty made a lot of laws, but rule of law originated in the West, not a Chinese cultural product. The Chinese people, the traditional concept on law is something equal with punishment. Law is punishment. Law is criminal law. Rule of law in Chinese traditional culture is a rule of punishment, rule of criminal law, which is actually rule of man, rule of the emperor or rule of the senior persons. For example, in village, when the 2 families had disputes, they wouldn't go to the court. They would go to a senior person like Jerry for mediation. So we just follow what the seniors say. That's traditional Chinese concept on law. China followed Marxism. The Marxism theory is very similar to Chinese traditional culture. According to Marxism, law is an instrument or weapon for the ruling class to rule the ruled classes under the society. You see, it's very similar to traditional Chinese legal culture. When I was a law student in 1980s, my professor asked a question: "What do you think about this law? What things you associate with law when law is mentioned?" Most students came up with concepts such as jail, execution, death penalty, police, army, and a criminal tribunal. So no one mentioned rights, freedoms with law. It's a very typical answer in the 80s. Some examples. There was no independence of law. Law is part of the politics. Policy is more important than law. And law is only one of the means to enforce policies. In U.S., law is everything. It's a country of lawyers. But in China, law is only part of the social mechanism. Court is part of the government agencies. No independent of court in the past. Before 1996, lawyers were government employees according to the law. Only in 1996, we changed the law, and the lawyers, the legal business were privatized. Lawyers are independent attorneys, and law school was combined with political science. In the past, law school include political science. The second question is the conceptual changes since 1979. Since 1979, China launched legal modernization programs aimed to prevent cultural revolution from happening again, also to facilitate economic and social development. I remember in early 80s, a nationwide debate among Chinese academics on whether China should apply rule of law or rule of man. It's a long-time nationwide debate. Most scholars prefer rule of law, not rule of man. Since 1979, China, offer more political rights and citizens to the people. Especially in 1979, we introduced direct elections in the under the county level Congress, and also the citizens was given the right to criticize the government, and the people began to enjoy more economic and social freedoms. Only two purposes, to give people more political, economic, social rights, and also to provide legal protections to social economic development. And then in 1982, the constitution was rewritten and adopted. So today, I ask the similar question to my students. So what do you associate once law is mentioned in your mind? Same questions, very different answers. Now, students will associate law with civil rights, dispute resolution, equity, and justice. No one mentioned, death penalty or jail, army. In Chinese bookstore, you can see, law books before was put together with the military books. Now you can see the attitude of the general public towards law changing. I'd like to mention, U.S. play a significant role in changing Chinese, public attitude towards rule of law. In 1979, U.S.-China established a diplomatic relationship. China-U.S. signed the joint communiques. Actually, we have 3 joint communiques. but you also have a Taiwan Relations Act. 2001, when Bush came to power, I noticed the then National Security Advisor Rice gave a TV interview talking about the relationship between the three joint communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. She said, the joint communiques are not U.S. law, it's our policy. We, as a government of law, we must follow Taiwan Relations Act. So the act, the law is above the policy. So that taught, Chinese leadership, Chinese general public, the law is more important than policy. It's a rule of law versus a rule of policy in dealing with China-U.S. relations. What are the changes? Firstly, Chinese people recognize law is the effective means to promote economic development, especially when China is changing from an agrarian society to industrial society, from planned economy to market economy. Law plays a significant role. Secondly, the Chinese people recognize the importance to establish a government of law, not of men. In 1999, rule of law was written into the Constitution. We changed the saying from rule by law to rule of law. In the past, when you mention rule of law, it's politically incorrect. You would take risk. But the Constitution incorporated rule of law. 2004, the State Council issued a detailed program how to implement the rule of law principle in government work. It's a challenge, It's not something new to apply law to the general public, but how to enforce legal rules against these government actions. It's a new, idea in China. In this regard, I think we made remarkable achievements. Since 1979, the government and the leadership change follow exactly the Constitution and the law. Everyone remember, the leadership change in the past always, very chaotic, very, troublesome, even by wars. But since 1979, you can see, basically, not every time, especially since 1990. I think that's, a big achievement if you look at the 5,000 years history. Secondly, a clear definition of powers and responsibilities for government institutions by law. Several provinces, cities, regions are doing experiments, how to implement rule of law. For example, in Hunan province, the governor Zhou Qiang, he is a lawyer. Now he's a party secretary. He required every government agency must, write down the powers provided by law to this particular agency. And after confirmation by relevant departments, the powers and functions of each government agency must be publicized in newspaper. How much power you have? The mayor of Handan city in Hebei province, after the lawyers clarified his powers according to the law, our mayor only has 93 powers and functions. He was very surprised. He thought he was a king of the kingdom. He could do everything, but following the law, only 33 powers and functions. Also, if the government does something wrong or illegal, citizens are entitled to bring the government to court and receive government compensations, which is already common sense in China. Firstly, to strictly regulate government licensing activities, to limit the government powers on licensing. The third made change on the concept of law. People associate law with more freedoms and rights. Especially in 2004, we made constitutional amendments. China respects and protects human rights was written into the Constitution. For the first time, human rights became a legal term, a constitutional term. Also, private property rights was written into the Constitution. In the past, it was regarded as bourgeoisie constitutional principle, but now, Chinese Constitution accepts this principle. Also, we recognize judicial independence. Even I agree with Jerry. We haven't done a good job in this regard, but we recognize the principle, judicial independence. An independent, fair, and efficient judicial system is essential to rule of law. Chinese Constitution has this principle. Fifth, who shall be the lawmakers? In the past, Chinese people thought the government, law comes from the government, which is a wrong idea. The laws comes from the people, from the Congress. So the government can make regulations, but if the regulation contravene the principle of law, people can challenge the legality or constitutionality of the government regulations. In 2001, there was a case. A lawyer from a Chinese lawyer bought a book in Hong Kong. The book was confiscated in Beijing airport because it was prohibited to bring in mainland. And this lawyer brings the immigration officer to the court. The court questioned the immigration agency, what's your legal basis, to confiscate his book? The agency, the officer said, we don't have any legal grounds. No executive regulation, and then the court ordered to return the book to the lawyer. Also in 2003, our state council government regulation was found unconstitutional because the regulation authorized the policeman to detain any person in the street if he or she doesn't have, 3 cards, ID card, residential card, and also worker card. One person was detained in Guangzhou City and was beaten to death. And then people found the police follow the executive regulation, which is unconstitutional. And then the regulation, because of unconstitutionality, the regulation was abolished. My final question is what we are doing currently. What are the experiments? I think the development of rule of law in China since 1979 can be divided into 3 stages. First, from 79 to middle 80s, we emphasize to restore legal order. Criminal law played a very important role. Second stage, since middle 80s to middle 90s, we emphasize on laws related to economic development. Civil law, criminal, economic law, business law. Third stage is since 2000, we emphasize the laws which regulate the behaviors of the government. That's the public law, constitutional, and administrative law. Our objective is to establish a new socialist system by the end of this year and to enhance judiciary. The Chinese National People's Congress will choose a date to announce this year because of the past 3 decades efforts. China will announce the new legal system have been formally established. That means not only not mean judiciary is satisfactory, but also but mainly about the legislation. We already make sufficient acts. I would like to brief a little bit the constitutionalization of the three represents and its impact. 三个代表. Many people don't understand the meaning of the three represents. According to the original context of Chinese Constitution, the Chinese government only represent. It is a government for the workers and the farmers, not a government for the public sectors, for the bourgeoisie, for the capitalists. Before 1988, to run private business was a crime. No private companies before 1988. So our first constitutional amendment is about the decriminalization of private business. So that's 1988. Since then, private business developed very fast in China. Now in many provinces, it already dominates the local economy. So the public economy became smaller and smaller. Now the Chinese central government only control 150 companies, only 150. All the rest privatized. So, but from the political and legal perspective, the government still does not represent the non-public factors. It's still a government for the workers and the farmers. So the three represents try to settle this problem. On the one hand, the Communist Party and the Chinese government still represents the workers and the farmers. On the other hand, the Communist Party and the Chinese government, according to the new constitutional amendment, also represent the new non-public sectors. You can see from the constitutional changes, the policy is very pragmatism. We made property rights law, which to protect people who have property. We also make a labor contract law, which protects the laborers. You can see now we try to make a balance. On the one hand, still represent workers and farmers. On the other hand, represent the new non-public sectors. Now the capitalists can join the Communist Party, can join the government, join the Congress. People. I also taught some courses to American students. People always ask one question: why the Communist Party can lead, the leadership can last over 60 years? I told them the CPC changes policies timely, from time to time according to the social and economic development. Even they don't change the party, but the party change policy. In US you change parties, but in China we don't change party, but we change policies. The result is the same. The result is the same. Okay. Another question I would talk is in the past we described the Chinese development model as socialism with Chinese characteristics, 有中国特色社会主义. Now we delete the word 有. Now it's 中国特色社会主义. Why we delete only one word, with? Now we call the Chinese style socialism. Because of Chinese law and the Chinese constitution permits the development of private economy and protect private property rights. People in China criticize. Some people criticize. We are going to the capitalism. They criticize we are going to the capitalism. Now the Chinese government rationale, the CPC rationale is we are not going to the capitalism, or American-style capitalism. We will still follow the principle of socialism. But this socialism is made in China, not made in Russia, not from the textbook of the classical works. It's from China. It's by Chinese people. So I think we try to explore another development model, another version of rule of law and democracy. I think it's possible. And what is the ultimate goal of the Chinese development? A fundamental question is, should China completely westernized? We already opened the door to the West. A lot of things are already westernized. Should China give up its 5,000 years history, culture, totally westernized? I think the answer is no. Modernization, some people say it's westernization, it's Americanization. The American-style capitalism and Chinese-style socialism do share, common grounds, common aspects, but also we have different thoughts, different opinions. The Beijing Olympic Games has a slogan, "One world, one dream." But I don't think one world, one system is a good idea. we can have one dream, but we cannot have one, system, one set of law. In conclusion, to establish a government based on rule of law, of democracy, honest, efficiency, and greenness is the ultimate goal of the Chinese people. China is determined to enhancing rule of law and strengthening human rights protection. U.S. has a tremendous experience in exercising rule of law. Yesterday, I went to a vote mount. I concluded why George Washington didn't want to stay in office after 80 years, because he had a very beautiful hometown. He had a lot of properties. I think we should work together to find a better rule of law for the human being. U.S. rule of law, of course, is good. As Jerry mentioned, Chinese people actually give much more credit to U.S. law than American people do. How to handle the disputes, the differences. I'd like to cite Confucius, his saying to conclude my presentation. Confucius said, "Gentlemen always get along with each other without compromising their values and principles. Petty persons always compromise without getting along." So let's be gentlemen, gentle ladies, gentle nations, and gentle human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two so wonderful presentations, so I hesitate to interrupt. And so we'll change the format. We'll continue, ask Edward Xu for his presentation. Then later on we have probably 10-15 minutes for
push some button here?
Yes. You're already on.
Already on. Okay, thank you.
Edward graduated from Princeton University, got a PhD in religion study.
Thank you, Professor Shen. Professor Shen asked us to be both harmonious and humorous. I think it's pretty hard to be both. Before my little talk, I would like to share with you one story. Last year, I got a chance to visit the tomb of the late John Layton Stewart in Hangzhou to pay my personal tribute. As you may know that Dr. Stewart is the former president of American-supported Yanjing University, and he is also the former American ambassador to China. It was Dr. Stewart's will to bury together with his wife in the old campus of Yanjing University, now part of Beijing University. The executing of the terms of his will, however, was blocked until last year, when his remains were able to return to Hangzhou to bury with his missionary parents. Through the great effort of General Fu, who was the president of the Committee of 100 Prominent Americans of Chinese descent, and also the good office of Mr. Xi Jinping, then the party secretary of Zhejiang province, but not uniting with his wife in Beijing. These and similar stories are quite symbolic. indicating that the fact that religion still serves as some kind of thermometer to the Sino-US relations, which is now close enough to allow Dr. Stewart to return to unite with his parents in Hangzhou, but still far enough to fulfill his wish to bury together with his wife in Beijing. Perhaps Chinese prefer to bury together with their parents, right? My talk actually will be really about religion in the Sino-US relations. It was divided into three parts. First, I will deal with how the Chinese scholars view the influence of religion on the current U.S. foreign policy. I think because of a time limit, I will skip this part. Secondly, I will deal with the Sino-US relations, interactions in the field of religion, or the so-called post-missionary religious interactions between China and the U.S. And finally, I will give some concluding remarks on the religious factor in Sino-US relations. So I will deal with the second part of my original speech, Sino-US interactions in the field of religion. For a long period of time, American missionaries had been serving as a spiritual vincular between China and America. The American missionary societies spend a huge sum of money and time and energy in the funding of numerous educational, medical, and philanthropic institutions, and build up a reservoir of goodwill to America and American people in China. But the forced withdrawal of these missionaries around 1950 has casted a long shadow over the Sino-US relations since then. Actually, in October 1994, Bishop T.K. Dean, the top leader of the Protestant Three Self Church in China, made a formal apology to the American missionaries and their families in a conference attended by former Presbyterian and Methodist missionaries in the East Coast of the United States. I think it's in Wellesley College, but I need to confirm that. In the conference, he said, quote, "I want to apologize to the former China missionaries and their families on behalf of Chinese Christians for all the suffering wrongly imposed on them 40 years ago. I will be glad if you will take my presence here as a token of healing and reconciliation in Christ after the wrong you have suffered from," end quote. But this belated apology has not obtained the approval of the Three Self hierarchy before the conference and has never been approved by it ever since. Now the religious interactions and exchanges between China and the United States have become much more pluralized than any time in the past. And the spiritual agents, or the mediums between the two countries, are no longer confined to missionaries, even though the missionaries has already come back in large number, sometimes with disguise and sometimes without it. Now these exchanges has taken various forms, such as religious publications, religious studies, faith-based NGOs, short-term missionaries, religious surveys, anti-religious terrorism, and the legislatures on religious freedom. That should be mentioned in the first part of my talk. But I must say that this exchange is quite unbalanced. Now, China is perhaps the largest religion importing country in the world. While the U.S. suffered the largest trade deficit with China, China in turn has a huge deficit in religious exchange with the United States. That is also showed by the previous panel on the popular culture. This is especially true in the area of religious publications. On the one hand, many books of American authors, from Billy Graham's The Secret of Happiness to Alice Gray's The Story for the Heart, biographies and autobiographies like A Family Man on James Dawson, to Jen Baker's I Was Wrong, have been translated and published in China by prestigious government publishing houses. I don't know why they choose Jen Baker's book to translate. The Reverend Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life has 3 Chinese versions and a 1 bilingual version in China. And the version by the Sanlian bookstore, which happens to be one of the largest publishing houses in China, which has alone been sold more than 250,000 copies. The first 2 volumes of the so-called Left Behind series have also been translated and printed in huge number. On the other hand, China has become one of the largest Bible exporting countries in the world, perhaps only after the United States. Now China prints more than 12 million copies of Bible each year, and among them 8 million are for exportation, and they are exported to 70 countries, more than 70 countries, in some 50 languages. The Amity Printing House, which was initiated, perhaps as some people here know, by the United Bible Societies, has just moved to a huge new plant, which has the capacity of printing more than 20 million copies of Bible each year. Actually, China is not only exporting Bible, China is also producing and exporting other religious goods. And a huge number of Russian icons and India gods are also produced in China, actually by a few counties in Canton province. Another area was examining is religious studies, especially religious studies at a university level or setting in China. I think this is one of the shining spots of Sino-US relations, religious exchange. It is not an exaggeration to say that nowadays a key government university in China, like Tsinghua, offers more courses on religion and enrolls more graduate students engaging in the study of religion than a comprehensive American university, not to mention those state universities. This development has much to do with all kinds of assistance and support from the U.S., such as Professor Lao's Luz Foundation and scholars like Professor Madison. Actually, this could mean that the Chinese university graduates might be more prepared than their American counterparts in facing the challenge of the global resurgence of religions. One religious group active in Sino-US relations is the faith-based NGOs. Now, like the missionaries, faith-based NGOs are right now allowed to work in China, even in the field of religion. US-based Eastgate International, Pocket Bible, and also Bible Society of Singapore, for instance, have distributed more than 6 million copies of China-made Bible in China in the last 20 years. Eastgate International has also built more than 300 Christian libraries all over China. Large-scale NGOs such as World Vision has offices in Beijing, even though we do not have the exact numbers. It is safe to say that there are at least hundreds of, if not thousands, of Western faith-based NGOs operating in China, and most of them are based in the U.S. American NGOs such as Kansas City-based Heart to Heart International and Franklin Grant's Samaritan's Purse among the first groups joined the earthquake rescue mission in Sichuan in the year 2008. Now, faith-based NGOs form the largest institutional presence of American religion in China. Another strong presence of American religion is perhaps the American expatriate community in China. Missionaries, including American missionaries, have also returned to China in large number. Now they came mainly in the form of short-term missionaries. China has the largest unreached people, quote unquote, and therefore is the center of the AD 2000 and the beyond movement, and also a focal point of the 10 to 40 window. Each summer, there are hundreds of Christian fellowships in the summer camps, organized by Eastern as well as Western missionaries in different places all over China. Because of the various reasons, China has not been a major destination for American missionaries yet, but religious publications, websites, and other means of communication provide American churches and missionary societies with alternative ways of evangelism. It is interesting to know that polling about religion has become another area of Sino-US cooperation at grassroots level. Polling about religion in China has emerged one after another by polling and research institutions in recent years. In China, there are several notable polling and surveys on religion, and one of them, conducted by the Shanghai's East China Normal University, found that 31.4% of Chinese aged 16 and above, about 300 million are religious. Among them, 40 million are Christians. Other surveys, like those of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and also the State Administration of Religious Affairs, have also found the great increase of religious believers around the country. The official three itself also wanted to carry out its own polling. On the U.S. side, there are also numerous surveys on China's religion, especially Christianity, and numbers of Christians, according to these surveys, varied from some 50 million to 130 million. And those U.S. surveys of Christianity in China are sometimes conducted by the Chinese, like the Pew Global Attitudes Survey projects of 2005 and 2006, and also the Committee of 100 survey of 2007. They all purchased their data from the Horizon Research Consultancy Group, a Chinese polling institution, as mentioned by previous speakers. Even a pure American polling has the participation of Chinese scholars, like the comprehensive Baylor University survey on Chinese religion completed last year. Actually, Baylor also purchased data from the Horizon. All these surveys have the effect of subverting the previous low government figures and began to have an impact on the government policy towards religion. If these figures, the figures of these surveys are true, then the U.S. and China are the number one and number two countries, or the alternative G2 countries in the world, in terms of their Christian population. Even though the Sino-U.S. religious encounters are not confined to government exchange, but the official exchange is still the crucial factor influencing the bilateral relations. This exchange could be both zoom in and zoom out the relationship between the two countries. Anti-religious terrorism is an area for Sino-U.S. cooperation. Both China and the U.S. have been infected by religious terrorism, but it is the U.S., not China, that is the biggest victim of religious terrorism or extremism. Religious terrorism is regarded by U.S. as the number one threat, or one of the most serious threats to its national security. But China is the country which is most unlikely to do any harm to the U.S. in this regard. Actually, the September 11th terrorist attacks on the U.S. have improved the troublesome relationship between the two countries around that time and made China an ally or at least a strange bedfellow in the U.S.-led campaigns against international terrorism. On the other hand, the Chinese government appreciated the airstrike on Xinjiang, Eastern Turkestan leaders in Pakistan by the U.S. Army, Air Force, even though it is sometimes criticized the double standards of the U.S. government in treating those Chinese-defined religious terrorists in the custody of the U.S. government. In short, anti-terrorism, religious terrorism, has become a more important strategic consideration, at least for a time being, in the Sino-U.S. relations than the other issues on religion. Among these other issues, religious freedom is definitely the most sensitive and challenging. It has been on the agenda of China-U.S. summits, especially during the Bush administration, and the China factor was quite outstanding in the legislative process of the passing of the IRFA, International Religious Freedom Act, in 1998. China is listed as one of the CPC countries, meaning countries of particular concern, which could also mean, incidentally, the Communist Party of China. China is also included in the list of religious freedom violators by both the Office and the Committee of International Religious Freedom. China is one of the 70-plus countries criticized by the U.S. in its annual religious report. If China could move out of the CPC list, then China should have no complaints, since the American interpreted standard of religious freedom is higher than that of the other countries. Actually, there are different understandings of China's religious freedom or discrimination issues in the U.S. Formerly, most American institutions, from the Freedom House to the Voice of the Martyrs, listed China as one of the least free or worst countries in terms of the religious freedom in the world, even though China scholars in the U.S. may have different views. Last year, the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life reported a new study entitled Global Restrictions on Religion, which examines the situation in 198 countries and regions. Basically, the study divides the restrictions on religion into two levels: governmental and societal, social. There are also various degrees of restrictions described as low, moderate, high, and very high. According to the study, the social hostilities towards religion are quite moderate in China, even though the government restrictions are still quite high. Therefore, the highest overall level of restrictions is not found in China, but in countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, India, Indonesia, Egypt, and Iran, where both measures are taken into account. The study admitted that it is confined only to the restrictions, not including the amount of religious dynamism, diversity, and expression in each country. If we take these overlooked elements into consideration, the religious situation in China could look even better. My view is that it will be pretty hard to find a situation of high or stiff government restrictions on religious practice coexist with the low social restrictions or hostilities. The relative openness and the low restrictions on religious practices in China may not be the intended result of the government policy, but the government contributed to this progress, at least indirectly, by opening up a huge private sector for all kinds of religion, or in that case, all kinds of other activities to survive, maneuver, and prosper, and therefore could take a great deal of credits for this relative openness of religious affairs in the country. In view of the current social acceptance of religion in China, some Chinese scholars even argue that the image of religion has already transformed in China from the opium of the people to the social capital in the country. Some final concluding remarks on religious factor in Sino-US relations. With regard to U.S. policy towards China, there has emerged a couple of bipartisan consensuses, one of which might be called the values consensus. That is to promote religious freedom in China, to put it very simply. The Democrats embracing religion and their victories in the last two elections have strengthened what I would like to call the trade protectionist religious human rights complex already formed in the Congress. Partly because religious freedom is a win-win issue for both parties, and the criticism on China's religious records will be continued, no matter which party is in power, though the economic and the trade issues apparently have become more prominent in the times of economic recession or crisis. Another bipartisan consensus might be called the China consensus, based on both the U.S. national interest and China's current international status. That is to regard the current U.S.-China relationship as one of the most important bilateral relations of the United States. And we have already seen more efforts in institutionalizing this consensus by this and the previous administrations. Actually, the economical interdependence between the two countries has already reached the level of mad, mutually assured destruction. In the normal circumstances, the China consensus will restrain the values consensus and makes the issues of religious freedom a relatively less important factor in the bilateral relations. But it is still possible for religious groups to change the status quo of the current Sino-US relations, to tip the balance, to quote Professor Richard Madison, and to have substantive effects on certain aspects of U.S. policy towards China by resorting to values generally accepted by Americans and forming a broader political coalition on religious freedom. Despite the huge differences in their respective positions, there still exists quite a few commonalities between Chinese and American governments in their views towards religion, also in their ways to handle religion in domestic and foreign policy. For instance, both sides regard religion as a vital factor to their national interest and security. Of course, there are greater differences between China and the U.S. in treating religion as a national security issue. Whereas religion is defined as a non-traditional security issue in the U.S., especially after the September 11th, China has always been regarding religion as a security issue ever since its founding some 60 years ago. As I argue in some other places, that national security and the united front are the two major considerations of the CPC in making its religious policy. whereas religion as a security issue has become harder and being regarded as a homeland security issue in the U.S., religion as a security issue has become softer in China, being increasingly expressed in the form of ideological rather than geopolitical threat to the regime. Secondly, both countries believe the existence of a hierarchy of human rights. Though the U.S. gives priority to religious freedom, which is called by some as the first liberty, put it very much on the top of the hierarchy of human rights, whereas China views it as much less important issue in its human rights agenda. But right now, the gap is narrowing since the Chinese government is becoming more aware of the importance of religion. Thirdly, both countries regard their model of social development and church and state relationship as exceptional, though the U.S. exceptionalism is more judgmental and often expressed in the form of universalism, whereas the Chinese exceptionalism is more self-defensive. It's often represented by its isolationist policy, resisting the so-called Western interference in its domestic affairs, especially in the area of religion. And finally, the foreign policy establishments of both countries are followers of what I would like to call the diplomatic materialism, or suffered from religion avoidance syndrome, to use the term of Thomas Farr, a Georgetown-based scholar. Promoting religious freedom as a foreign policy issue, as some insiders criticized, is ghettoized or departmentalized in the State Department, and is far from being mainstreamed in American foreign policy. In China, the importance that government attached to religion has never matched its rhetoric, such as there's nothing trivial in religious affairs. And it is well known that the administrations of religious affairs of both the local and the central governments are poorly staffed and have never been coveted jobs in the Chinese officialdom. Actually, with the pluralizing and pragmatizing of China's national interests, the status of religion is decreasing in the country's strategic and foreign policy consideration. For instance, few people in China right now would argue that religion is more important than the issues of Chinese currency appreciation or the increasing price of iron ore from Australia. It does seem that both countries need to address the issue of religion gap or religion deficit if they want to take religion very seriously as in international as well as domestic issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Richard, it's your turn.
Well, for me, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. A great pleasure because I got a chance to see some old friends, both on the American side and on the Chinese side. And a great honor, of course, to be here at the Wilson Center, which has had such a distinguished role to play in international dialogue. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with Professor Xu because...
The mic, I think it's... Does it work?
Okay. Because I spent a year at Fudan, year before last, and my office was down the hall from him. And I learned an awful lot of things about religion in China and in foreign affairs from him. And I probably distorted what I've learned, but a lot of it is in my paper, probably in a distorted way. But in any case, what I'd like to do today briefly is, in my paper, I talk about three themes. Okay. The first theme is that the dynamic evolution of religion worldwide and its changing relationships with society is causing certain common challenges, common difficulties to both the United States and to China, and in fact to societies around the world. So we share common dilemmas, common challenges. We have somewhat different ways of trying to deal with those challenges, and those differences come partly from different cultural assumptions and different historical precedents and experiences. And these differences lead to certain amounts of irritation, indeed tension, in U.S.-China relations. But then a final theme is that are different ways of trying to deal with these new religious challenges. Neither of them are, in fact, being terribly effective, or at least their success is ambiguous. And so, at least although we have conflicts over our differences, we can share the sort of dilemma and confusion and misery of not being able to resolve these difficulties no matter what. So, in general, that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay. So, first of all, I'm talking about some of the common issues, the common dilemmas, which have to do with the collapse of our assumptions about secularization and modernity. Okay. Now, unlike liberal democracies like the United States, which generally accord their citizens the right of complete freedom for religious belief and practice, the Chinese government asserts the need to control religion so as to preserve social harmony and economic modernization. The government, as you know, officially has the Bureau in charge of religious affairs, the State Administration for Religious Affairs. The state claims the prerogative of determining what counts as true and false religions, and it uses the power of the police to wipe out what it considers false religion, also known as evil cults or feudal superstition or whatever. The state also chooses the leaders of approved religions and monitors many of the activities of the religions themselves. So this is different from a country like the United States. But on the surface, at least, the Chinese government shares a fundamental assumption with most liberal democracies, including the United States, the assumption that secularity is indispensable for modernity. The constitutions of liberal democracies like the United States are premised on political philosophies of the Western Enlightenment, in America those of John Locke, which hold that religious belief should be relegated to private life, to a realm of personal freedom protected by a religiously neutral state. Chinese official policy toward religion is also based on a secularization assumption, in this case, though, derived from Marxism, at least officially. The main policy that's still in effect is set out in the Communist Party Central Committee document number 19, promulgated in 1982. Just like liberal democracies, document 19 relegates religious belief to private life. The crux of the policy of freedom of religious belief, it says, is to make the question of religious belief a private matter, one of individual free choice for citizens. So that's the policy. It's the same policy basically enshrined in the American Constitution, at least from that point of view. A major difference between China and the USA, however, is on the question of the neutrality of the state toward religion. In the USA, the government can't give any direct material support to religious belief, and it cannot use its power to favor one religious community over another. This religious neutrality extends to the question of whether religion has any future in the modern world. For example, in the United States, over 90% of the population says that they believe in God. But among the 10% who say they don't, there are disproportionately represented intellectual elites, like social scientists. Okay? They did, for example, a content analysis of the American Political Science Review, which is the mainstream leading journal for political scientists, a few years ago when it had its 100th anniversary celebration. And they found out that in 100 years, only 4 articles use religion as an independent variable. So this gives you a sense of how American intellectuals have thought about the importance of religion in the modern world. However, the American government gives a lot of informal moral support to religious communities. To get elected, politicians have to profess profound respect for religion. Most are sincere about this, actually, and encourage religious leaders to send them their views and provide public guidance on moral issues. The difference with China is that the Chinese Communist Party's document 19 officially declares that religion is false and makes government an activist agent of a modernizing project that would eventually eliminate religion entirely. It says we communists are atheists and must unremittingly propagate atheism. It says, however, that unlike the leftist policies of the Cultural Revolution, this elimination should be done patiently through education and so forth, not through harsh administrative means. But even though this is different from the American government's constitutionally, protected policy, It's based on assumptions that are still widely shared among many elite social scientists in liberal democracies. Most elite social scientists until fairly recently in the U.S. would probably agree with Document 19 that religion is a historical phenomenon with its own cycle of emergence, development, and demise, a demise which will inevitably come with modernization. But both the liberal democratic U.S. and Chinese communist approaches toward religion are facing challenges these days, common challenges, in part because their shared assumptions about the inevitable march of secularization seem to be wrong. Faced with the facts of an increasingly vigorous engagement of religions with public life all over the world, many Western social theorists, even confirmed agnostics like Jürgen Habermas, are now searching for what they call post-secular social theories. Although there's great disagreement about the content of such theories, they would all agree that the rise and demise of religion doesn't follow a linear pattern. They would note that religion not only persists, but continues to evolve dynamically in modernized societies. They would indeed recognize that there are multiple modernities defined by different interactions between religious belief and practice and modern political and economic development. They would recognize that religion cannot usually be confined to private life, but for better or for worse is becoming an active part of public life around the world. In liberal democracies like the United States, the consequences of this dynamically evolving, publicly assertive religious beliefs are often intractable cultural wars, as we call them, over the content of public education and over social issues like limitations on the right to abortion, on same-sex marriage, physician-assisted suicide. Also in the USA, there are unresolved dilemmas about how to handle the connection between some forms of religious extremism, Islamic, but also Christian fundamentalists and others, and political violence. In Western liberal democracies, however, there is at least space for lively, if sometimes acrimonious and painful public debates carried out through all sorts of media and in various social movements about how to accommodate religion in the public sphere. And these debates provide resources for dealing with difficult religious and political issues, even though these debates have not reached any clear conclusion yet in this country. Now in China, the secularist assumptions that underpin official religious policy are likewise proving unworkable. The policies flowing from Document 19, I believe, are a failure on their own terms. The policy aims to constrain the growth of religion, to confine it to the private sphere, and to keep it from affecting politics and ethnic relations. Yet despite all efforts to control its growth, religion has grown rapidly and overwhelmed China's systems for surveillance and control. Document 19 concludes that party members must have a sober-minded recognition of the protracted nature of the religious question under socialist conditions. Those who expect to rely on administrative decrees or other coercive measures to wipe out religious thinking and practices with one blow are entirely wrong, are going to do no small harm. However, the inability to facilitate the spread of secularism by patient education has led to a resort to clumsy coercive methods which have actually intensified religiously inspired conflict with the state in some places. Moreover, the attempt to disconnect religion from ethnic conflict has sometimes added religious zeal to ethnic zeal. It's backfired. The failure is obvious enough that the leadership of the Communist Party has begun to recognize it, and some within the government and consultants like Professor Xu are searching for a new approach to religious policy. But constraints on debate about sensitive religious matters make it difficult for the party and the state to move beyond the old policy with its untenable assumptions, and when they do move, it is not necessarily in a liberal dimension. Like all sensitive issues, discussions about religious policy in China are not carried out in public forums. This makes a big difference from the United States. But they're carried out in closed-door meetings that bring together some academic experts and some political leaders. In the discussions that I've witnessed and even taken part in, leading Chinese experts often agree that the Document 19 theoretical framework is unworkable. Whether top party leaders will actually admit this publicly in the near future is questionable, because there is an issue about party infallibility on these issues. But admit it or not, China's basic the party's basic strategy seems to be evolving along the lines suggested by leading experts. Experts like Zhou Xinping, the director of the Institute of World Religions at CAS. And it's a direction which I would just summarize briefly as kind of a back to the future. In my view, it's based less on any assumptions from Marxism, Leninism, or Marxist theory, and more on precedents and cultural assumptions stemming from China's past and policies of the old Ming-Qing emperors. Okay? The basic policy of the Ming-Qing emperors was that religion that the state is the master and religion the follower. Zhengzhu Jiaocong. And at the emperor, of course, and representing the state, combined the roles of what in the West was the king and the pope in one person, and had the prerogative of deciding what was true religion, what was false religion, and supporting the true and helping the true and patronizing it, and of course suppressing the false. Among the elites who advised the emperor were people who didn't the Confucian elites who didn't necessarily take religion all that seriously, but saw it as basically a good thing if preserved respect for family life and social harmony and so forth, and made a careful distinction between those kinds of religion that were sectarian, that caused people to kind of break those hierarchical bonds and potentially lead to various kinds of rebellion. So that was the old Ming-Qing policy, and in a certain sense, I think the general approach that the state is groping toward in China is indebted to that, at least more indebted to that than standard Marxism, Leninism. And these precedents from the past point to a policy in which the state tolerates a wide range of religious practices, now under the rubric of respect for cultural pluralism. The government insists that the cornerstone of its policy is the constitutional guarantee in China of religious freedom. But this is a different kind of freedom from that of the Western liberal tradition. In some ways, as Zhou Xinping and other Chinese scholars note, the Chinese policy of religious freedom gives more support to religion than countries like the United States, which insists on a strict liberal separation between church and state. Under the liberal principle of separation, the government is forbidden from giving any direct economic support to churches. But in China, the government actually pays to build churches and pays the salaries of religious functionaries, at least those belonging to the officially sanctioned patriotic associations. This government patronage is indeed in line with the imperial states, the old Ming-Qing state patronage of temples. This is not a liberal tradition based on an inalienable right of freedom to religious association. It is a modern manifestation of the old imperial principle that the state is the master, religion the follower. The state reserves the prerogative of determining what kind of practice is orthodox true religion and what kind of orthodox evil cult. In 2008, the propaganda department published a video making just kind of distinction between true religion and false religion. Distinction is mostly based on the practical implication of religion. Does it or does it not contribute to a harmonious society under the direction of the party and the state? To be fully legitimate, religions need to contribute actively to building a harmonious society. If they're not contributing actively, the state needs to take responsibility to guide them so that they will fulfill their obligations. If they don't accept guidance, the state needs to crush them. In this new incarnation, the supposedly secular Chinese state also assumes a holy aura. It presents itself as carrier of a sacred national destiny. It carries out spectacular public rituals like the opening ceremonies of the Beijing Olympics, ceremonies that powerfully evoke the glorious cultural heritage of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, but actually gave no mention at all to Mao Zedong or even to socialism. This can lead to new patterns of religious tolerance and repression. In the past, for example, local village temple worship was labeled feudal superstition and suppressed in the name of Marxist modernization. In the emerging new policy, local temple worship, and literally there have been millions of temples built at rural levels in the last decade, and these popular religious festivals are now being relabeled, given a new name as non-material cultural heritage. Under this new definition, they're even to be encouraged as long as they keep villagers happy and perhaps draw in some tourism. This evolving new policy may lead to a growing toleration and even encouragement of a wide variety of religious practices, even of multiple forms of Christianity. These are practical outcomes that will be welcomed by many Americans, but the logic behind this toleration will be different from that which most Americans adhere to. Embedded in the Constitution and other documents at the core of American culture is the notion that the state should be politically secular. It should be neutral toward religion, even as the state's leaders give moral encouragement to the practice of religion among private citizens as a vital part of a free civil society. But the Chinese state, in a certain sense, seems to be becoming more politically religious. It supports orthodox religions, even more generously than in the past, while suppressing heterodox ones, and it claims the right to distinguish between orthodox and heterodox. This leads, of course, to episodes like the suppression of Falun Gong, an example of religious persecution whose logic would be difficult for most Americans to understand. Even though most Americans would not agree with the teachings of Falun Gong, and those who are devout Christians or Jews might even think that Falun Gong is a false religion, they would not understand the basis for the state's pronouncement that Falun Gong was an evil cult rather than a true religion. They would think that the state should refrain from making such determinations. Even though they have no personal sympathy toward Falun Gong, and even if they personally think that Falun Gong is untrue, they do not see why it should be persecuted as long as it carried out basically peaceful activities. Another area where the policy has practical differences with the West is in the treatment of what could be called axial religions, those religions from the so-called axial age that philosophers like Karl Jasper said came about 2,500 years ago, when the great world religions were founded, which basically opened up the principle that there was a supreme God, a supreme being, a supreme principle, like in Buddhism, that was above any king or earthly ruler, and that could be used to call the king to account. This is at the heart of Christianity, at the heart of Islam, and so forth. And even though those religions in China can basically say that they're willing to be cooperative with the state, the fact that this principle is somehow buried in their DNA somewhere makes them, I think, perpetually under suspicion, at least, and problematic within this new policy. So, as I see it, the emerging Chinese policy sees religion as part of Han Chinese cultural heritage, has difficult time accepting a faith that would criticize that culture on the basis of a transcendent principle. Thus, Christianity will probably always be subject to more government suspicion than Han Chinese Buddhism and Taoism, which don't have the same culturally transcendent principles as Christianity or Islam. So therefore, in conclusion, America, like China, is facing challenges in accommodating the dynamic evolution of religion in a post-secular age. We can sympathize with each other over the difficulties of confronting these challenges. On both sides of the Pacific, intellectuals especially need to rethink their assumptions about good governance in face of the realities of a post-secular age. But the way of dealing with these challenges in America and China is different, and this will continue to be a source of irritation in U.S.-China relations. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Madison. Now, floor is open. Any questions? Please raise your hand. Yeah, I'll go with that gentleman first. Yeah.
Yafeng Xia, Western Center public scholar. In his concluding remarks, Professor Cohen said that, I hope I get Professor Cohen right. Professor Cohen said that the improvement in the rule of law in China depends on something like a former Soviet leader Gorbachev type of person in the Politburo on the top post of Chinese government. My question is to the Chinese scholars here, or Professor Wang especially, that do you think that this is too much a price for the Chinese to pay? And have the Chinese people been taught in the last 20 years that all the negatives changes in Russia? Thank you very much.
Jerry, you want to respond first? And
Yeah.
then,
I wasn't endorsing the specific policies of perestroika, but using it as one of two illustrations of the need, if something's going to happen, for leadership at the top. China, as I indicated, over the last 30 years, has put together an impressive series of able, overlapping elites that are not only calling for law reform, but actually trying to implement it. And what they have lacked is support at the top, because the premises of the party leadership so far are contrary to the very legal values they have called for and put into the Chinese constitution. There's a paradox here, a conflict, and someday there will be a leader who will be sensitive to the needs for genuine law reform and greater autonomy allowed to a legal system. And it's not going to happen under this system unless you have a strong leader. I'm not suggesting that a strong leader has to come in and commit suicide for the regime, but I am suggesting, by referring, for example, to Zhu Rongji's example, that there must be somebody who's willing to make this his platform, his contribution to Chinese history and contemporary government. Otherwise, I think things will continue, and I think social tensions will grow. The increasing number of dissatisfied groups will enlarge, and it's going to be unnecessary challenge to the system that should be focusing on institutional change to meet the growing demands for change in light of China's great progress and the social, political, economic ferment that it has introduced. But I wasn't calling for some leader who's going to say, now we can collapse the Chinese system, because that's, after all, what Gorbachev ultimately stood for. But the type of strength of character and determination and the need to go on the line for personal rights and human rights and a genuine rule of law. Otherwise, in this kind of system, I don't see it happening, short of a kind of revolution that I don't think anybody in China really wants.
Yeah, I think Jerry already answered the question. We probably do need a lawyer leader, but we don't need Gorbachev, because if China was to split, no country would benefit from a Chinese collapse, just like Soviet Union. So I think Jerry already answered the question.
I remember in May of 1989, some journalists asked some of the students in Tiananmen Square, where is China's Gorbachev? And the answer was, our Gorbachev is in high school. Well, now he or she would be in the late 30s. I don't know how long that kind of a leader will take to come forth, but I hope there will be somebody who will not call for collapse of the system, but its improvement.
Okay, Ambassador Roy, then lady in the back, and
I know we're running out of time. Stapleton Roy with the Wilson Center, but in looking at the role of religion in perceptions of the United States and China, we haven't really looked at the question of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. I wonder, Professor Xu, if you could at least briefly comment on that, because it is certain when people think about religion in China, in our minds, the Dalai Lama always emerges as one of the issues.
Well, this is, of course, a very sensitive issue for me to answer. But I think when the territorial integrity or national sovereignty is involved, it's pretty hard for both sides to calm down. So I think Dalai Lama is not by himself. He represents a group of people in Tibet, or in Tibet exile government outside of outside of China. But it's a hard issue for me to answer right now.
Yeah, from Philadelphia. Inquirer.
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'd like to ask Dean Wong, when I was last at your law school, which was 5 years ago, I met with students who were studying public interest law and were very enthusiastic about going to the outskirts of Beijing and helping local peasants, farmers, understand their legal rights about land confiscation. With private interest lawyers, with public interest lawyers who are private lawyers now being under great pressure, can you tell me whether you still have classes of young people who want to go into public interest law? What do you advise them? And what values do they think that they are pursuing if they are thinking about taking up public interest cases?
Yeah, we still have we call legal aid program courses to students. We encourage students to engage in public interest work upon graduation. For example, this year, 10% of our law school, 406 graduates, go to the grassroots, go to the West to do, public interest work in the grassroots. We even established this year a special scholarship to encourage. So I think it's we also have collaboration with the Ford Foundation on the Barefoot Lawyers Program mentioned by Jerry. In many provinces, each summer we send students, different groups to different provinces to do pro bono work to the farmers.
I just add to that. Even in the United States, public interest law and especially legal aid clinics at American law schools are controversial, especially when it comes to continuing congressional funding of those activities, because they end up challenging very major vested interests in society. And some politicians find that objectionable, to have some of their major important constituents' interests tread upon by these federally funded public interest groups, usually based in the law school. And it's certainly controversial in China. And on occasion, their activities have been restricted, despite general Chinese interest in law schools using clinical organizations to give students some practical experience while they're studying. I wanted to say just two final points about the growing pressures that I see under the leadership, under the surface in China often, for continuing reform. One is, I meant to say earlier, that even the Communist Party, some years ago during this current past decade, when they had to deal with ousting people from the party, depriving them of their party membership or other significant sanctions, in many provinces had rules that had to be followed in terms of giving the person whose membership in the party, for example, was challenged, notice of what the offense was against the party, giving them a hearing, giving them a chance to have someone advise them, requiring a decision in writing, allowing them to appeal. These are the basics of due process of law. And it would be impressive to see the Chinese formal judicial system achieve those elements, not to mention the party, but the party itself, when treating its own elite, at least in principle. I don't know to what extent it's put into practice. I never can find anybody who claims to know anything about it. But they recognize these elements of fundamental fairness, notice and hearing, opportunity to defend yourself, etc. Reasoned decision. The other point, on June 28th, a former student of mine who's Taiwan's leading lawyer, Chen Changwen, C.V. Chen, published an article in the Zhonghua Shibao, the China Times. It's very significant. He said, now that ECFA looks like it was going to come into effect, you had to be very cautious about expecting much further progress in reconciliation between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait until mainland China developed a better legal system. That he thought it would be hard to have much more significant progress unless China really develops its legal system. This was a really striking thought. I've always related Taiwan's response to the mainland's blandishments and offers of reconciliation to the need for having something they would recognize as democracy, rule of law, but here a leading figure, close friend of the president, Ma Ying-jeou, is telling people, don't get too excited about much further progress, because further progress is going to be harder. It's not going to involve economic interests only. It's going to involve legal development and confidence in each other's legal system. That's a very important point.
Thank you, Jerry. I think by the way, Dean Wang just raised 100 million RMB. So he already have a very fancy law school building. Now he's trying to build up the second one inside Tsinghua. So that shows one of the small cases that shows the legal system or legal teaching, or at least education is expanding. Alan, yeah, please.
Thanks. Ellen Frost, going back to the subject of perceptions about religion, I want to put three perceptions very quickly on the table because I think they're basic. The first is, from an American perspective, inherent natural rights. That phrase was used by George Washington when a Jewish rabbi thanked him for his policy of tolerance of the Jews, and he wrote back and said that tolerance implies that one group has the power to tolerate another, and that isn't what the American Republic is all about. It's about the inherent natural right to practice religion, and I think that's one of the filters I think we use. Another American perception is that religion is benign. It's something that people do that's mostly harmless, whereas I think in the memory of Chinese, it's wasn't that long ago when the Taiping Rebellion, which ravaged China, was led by a man who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And the Boxer Rebellion was an anti-Christian cult with sort of spiritual beliefs about invulnerability and so on, so that it is not perceived necessarily as benign in China, but rather as a potential threat to the order and stability of the state. And because Americans don't understand history, I don't think they're sensitive to that. So that notion of is a second part of this, I think. And then finally, my own personal perception, which I'll just put on the table as a question, really, for anyone to comment on. But I think the Chinese, like every human being, have certain spiritual needs. We're all human. We all have some spiritual hunger for doing something a little greater than ourselves. Well, ideology is dead in China. Religion is practiced, but only by a certain minority. So is it possible that the emphasis on harmonious society is the government's effort to sort of instill some ethical or even spiritual elements back into the political dialogue? Or is it perhaps more likely that in response to the earthquake, for example, Chinese themselves are feeling the need for altruism, rushing to help people in a spontaneous way, which is another way of sort of satisfying this, what I'm postulating as some spiritual need. I could be wrong. That's just my personal perception.
Yeah, I'll let people wait. Dr. Wang, probably last question. You have 1 minute to comment or raise your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I have a question for Mr. Cohen. My name is Wang Hui Yao from a visiting fellow at Brookings. Actually, you talk about the Taiwan experience, and also we were talking, they were asking about what's the changes in China, where there's pin the hopes of the Perestroika, Gorbachev type of leaders. But what about the other possibility that you said about ECFA, and now ECFA has reached, now we're going to probably talk beyond ECFA, and next year will be the 100 years of the Republic, and so what if the two sides of the street has have some new proposals, like China going to unify with Taiwan, with the hope that the Kuomintang, which is already, they call themselves also China and Kuomintang, return to mainland. So as a swap, so that to make China unify Taiwan, and also Taiwan KMT return to mainland, and as the 100 years of anniversary of Republic. So what about that possibility of going back instead of a pin the hope on one person?
Jerry, you have 1 minute.
More than enough for that simple problem. Of course, whatever the people on Taiwan want to do, that would be fine. The question is, would a majority of the people on Taiwan approve that? And that raises the question of to what extent does Taiwan's new evolving democratic system contemplate consultation of the majority of the people. And right now, the Kuomintang is in a position, of course, to put this through the legislature the way they did ECFA. But if they want to avoid a revolution, they have to do better in the future about enlisting a lot of the people who regard themselves as Taiwanese in the cause. And there's such profound distrust. And the way the two parties are getting along now, I was disappointed in the way both have conducted themselves vis-a-vis ECFA. I felt President Ma should have done more to be consulting the other side and the legislature from the outset of his negotiations, instead of keeping everybody in the dark and then fogging it through the legislature. I was also disappointed in the DPP cutting and running because they were going to lose, instead of playing the role of a responsible opposition by going over ECFA as their compromise proposal from Wang Jinping offered them, and just instead abandoning the thing so that they don't tell the people on Taiwan more about ECFA than they now know. So I think your solution is a brilliant solution, would be highly appropriate in historical terms, except for one major thing. Would a majority of the people on Taiwan agree to that?
Yeah. Professor Madison, I would like to ask you to answer Ellen's question, whether we have a spiritual need. What's the American reading of that?
Well, look, first of all, in China, a lot of people are trying to meet spiritual needs. This is part of the challenge, the problem. It's been estimated, the figures that Professor Xu gave, that there are about 300 million, maybe more, religious believers. That means people actually who are participating in some religious congregation in some official way. But over and above that, there are many, many more. And it's been estimated by some, even by one of these surveys, the Jingdian survey, that maybe 90% of the population believes in some form of spirituality, if by that you define it very, very broadly to mean any time someone dies, people would say a prayer or burn some incense and do things like that for good luck. if you count it that way, probably the level of belief is about the same as in the United States. So the question is people all over are looking for this, but then how it will be kind of challenged and regulated and made to, work for the public good and not to have backlashes. So perhaps a question about the Dalai Lama, I was going to talk about that, it wasn't time, or in Xinjiang in Islam, is that sometimes what's happened is the government's policies have made the problem worse by bringing the religion into it. So there are problems with Tibet. They have to do with ethnicity, economics, politics, and so forth. But the government has demonized the Dalai Lama's, spiritual credentials, and that gives the Tibetans a certain kind of religious solidarity and anger that is added to other things that would have made them angry. In Xinjiang, I think it's even more obvious. There are problems with the Uyghurs that have to do, again, with economic and social issues, attitudes toward the Han. And I think the recent, riots, uprisings a year ago were not directly related to religion. But to some degree, some of the government's policies about trying to suppress Islam, to keep people from practicing Ramadan and don't allow women to wear a veil or things like that, have the danger of actually adding religious gasoline to what's already a problem, making the problem worse. So I think the challenge, it's a challenge, and I don't know what the answer is, because we used to have similar problems here in the West, with political Islam, is how to separate political economic things from religious things, so that the religious problem doesn't get added to other problems and making the situation even more difficult to deal with.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much because of time. So this is the end of today's session. Ambassador Roy, you have anything to add or make any announcement?
You might just mention that we'll reassemble at
9 a.m. tomorrow, but 8:30 I assume the coffee will be ready. So thank you all for participating. Thank you.